The Missouri Pacific line out of St. Louis ran west through country that didn't care about you. Clara Bennett had learned that much in the 7 hours since she'd climbed aboard with a carpet bag, a letter of employment folded twice inside her coat pocket, and approximately $4.30 to her name. The train didn't care whether she arrived. The land rolling past the smudged window didn't care either. Snow had been falling since noon, and by the time the light went gray and thin in the late afternoon, the prairie outside looked like something that had given up on color entirely. She was 23 years old, and she had been trying not to cry for most of the journey. The letter in her pocket was from a woman named Mrs. Harriet Fowler of Dalton Creek, Wyoming Territory, who had advertised in the St. Louis Courier for a housekeeper of sober habits and practical disposition. Clara had answered the advertisement in October, and Mrs. Fowler had replied promptly with terms: $12 a month, room and board included, work to begin no later than the 26th of December. The letter had a warmth to it that the advertisement lacked, and Clara had read it so many times in the weeks since that the paper had softened at the creases. She had no particular reason to doubt Mrs. Fowler. She had no particular reason to trust her either, but $12 a month was more than she'd been making at the laundry in St. Louis, where the steam had been ruining her hands since she was 19, and the foreman had a way of looking at her that made her skin crawl. When a door opened, even a door into the unknown, you walked through it, or you stood still. Clara Bennett had never been much good at standing still. She'd barely slept the night before. Anxiety, mostly, and the cold that had been working its way through the walls of her rooming house all week. On the train, with the rhythm of the wheels and the warmth of the coal stove at the end of the car, her body simply quit on her. She folded her coat against the window, set her bag on her lap, and was asleep before she'd finished the thought she'd started. She woke to silence. Not the silence of sleep, the silence of stopped things. The wheels weren't turning. The stove had cooled. The car was dim, and when she pressed her face to the window, she could see lamplight on snow and a sign she didn't recognize. Black Hollow. Elevation 4,812 feet. She sat there for a moment, reading the sign twice as if it might change. It didn't. The car was empty. She was the only passenger left, and somewhere between sleep and waking, everyone else had gotten off at their correct stops. The conductor was nowhere in evidence. The train itself gave a long, low metallic groan, like a sleeping animal turning over, and Clara realized with a lurching feeling in her chest that it was preparing to move again. She grabbed her bag and ran. The platform at Black Hollow was a single plank of warped wood, elevated maybe 6 inches off the frozen ground, sheltered by an overhang that did almost nothing against the wind driving off the mountains to the west. Clara stumbled off the train steps and hit the platform at an angle, catching herself on a post before she went down entirely. Behind her, the train was already moving, slowly at first and then with gathering indifference, until its rear lantern was just a red smear in the falling snow, and then nothing at all. She stood there a moment, breathing hard, her bag clutched against her chest. Around her, Black Hollow presented itself with zero ceremony. It was not a large place. One main street, or what passed for one, maybe 8 or 9 buildings on each side, most of them dark, a few with windows lit against the early dark of Christmas Eve. A general store, a livery, something that might have been a hotel or might have been a boarding house. It was hard to tell from the outside. Snow had drifted against the storefronts in irregular shapes, and the wind came through in gusts that had a mean edge to them, the kind of cold that found the gap between your collar and your jaw and worked in like a blade. Dalton Creek, she knew from the conductor's initial announcement, was still 3 stops west. She had no money for another ticket. She had no way to telegraph Mrs. Fowler without money. She had no shelter, no acquaintance in this town, and no plan beyond walking through that door at the end of the platform marked Station Agent, Inquiries, which turned out to be locked. She knocked anyway. Office is closed, a voice said through the wood, not unkindly, but not leaving much room for discussion. I need assistance, Clara said. I boarded at St. Louis and fell asleep and missed my stop. I'm trying to reach Dalton Creek. A pause. Then, next train west doesn't run till the 27th. Holiday schedule. She closed her eyes for a moment. Is there somewhere I can wait? A waiting room? Waiting room's got no stove till the 28th. Stovepipe cracked last week. She stood at the locked door for another few seconds, then picked up her bag and walked back out into the snow. The general store was open, barely. A bell above the door announced her entrance with more enthusiasm than anyone inside seemed to feel. There was a man behind the counter, heavy-set, with a gray beard that needed attending to, and a woman sitting by the window knitting something complicated in dark wool. They both looked up when Clara came in. "Merry Christmas," Clara said, because it seemed like the thing to say. Neither of them replied. "I've had a bit of an accident," she continued, stopping a few feet inside the door. "I was meant to reach Dalton Creek today, and I fell asleep on the train and missed my stop. I've no money for another ticket, and the station agent tells me the next train west isn't until the 27th. I was hoping someone might know of work I could do in exchange for a night's shelter, just the one night." The man behind the counter looked at her the way you looked at a problem you weren't responsible for and didn't intend to become responsible for. "Nothing here," he said. "Store's closing in 10 minutes. Christmas Eve." "Is there a boarding house? Or someone who might—" "There's Greta Holst 2 doors down," the woman by the window said, without looking up from her knitting. "She takes in boarders now and then, but she won't do it for free, and she won't do it for a stranger with no money and no references on Christmas Eve." "I have a letter," Clara said, "from my employer in Dalton Creek. It explains my situation." "Dalton Creek's not Black Hollow," the man said. "We don't know Dalton Creek's business here." She stood there a moment longer, hoping one of them would soften. Neither did. The bell above the door announced her exit the same way it had announced her entrance, with mechanical cheerfulness that had nothing to do with the situation. She tried the boarding house. Greta Holst was a tall woman, narrow-shouldered, with the look of someone who had stopped believing in generosity as a practical matter some years back. She listened to Clara's explanation on the front porch. She didn't invite her inside, which told Clara most of what she needed to know, and then said, "I'd need payment in advance, $2 for the night." "I have $4.30, Clara said, "but I need it for the ticket west on the 27th. "Then I can't help you. Is there anyone else in town who might—" "Miss," Greta Holst said with the patience of someone explaining something obvious, "it's Christmas Eve, and there's a blizzard coming off the Laramie Range. The whole town's shutting down for the night. I don't know who you are or where you came from, and I'm not going to know because I'm going back inside to my fire." She paused. "There's the livery. Tom Adler keeps it warm enough for the horses. He might let you sleep in the back. Might not. That's up to Tom." She went inside. Tom Adler at the livery was a younger man than Clara had expected, maybe 30, with a pleasanter face and less pleasant instincts. He heard her out, leaning against the frame of the livery door with his arms folded, and then let his eyes travel over her in a way that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Sleep in the back with the horses, sure," he said, with a slow grin that had nothing warm in it. "We could probably work something out." "Thank you," Clara said. "I'll keep looking." She was back in the street before he finished laughing. The wind had picked up. She could feel the temperature dropping in the way that was more than just cold. It had a quality of seriousness to it, the kind of cold that didn't ask permission. The snow was falling faster now, coming in sideways gusts that stung her face, and the lamplight from the remaining open buildings was beginning to take on that particular muffled quality that meant the storm was closing in. She had been in Black Hollow for approximately 45 minutes. She stood in the middle of the street, her bag at her feet, and looked at the building she hadn't tried yet. The saloon at the far end, from which came the sound of voices and something trying to be music. A dark building that might have been the doctor's office. A church with no lights in the windows. She picked up her bag and started walking. The saloon was called the Copper Nail, which was either a clever name or an accident. Clara pushed through the door because the cold had gotten serious enough that she no longer cared much about the social mathematics of a woman walking into a saloon alone on Christmas Eve. Inside, there were maybe a dozen men, a smell of beer and sawdust and wet wool, and a collective attention that swung toward her the instant she walked in like a weather vane in a crosswind. The bartender, a short man with a generous mustache and wary eyes, set down the glass he was polishing. "Help you?" he said, in a tone that suggested helping her was not high on his list of intentions. "I need to speak with someone who might know of temporary shelter," Clara said. She'd found that being direct was more efficient than elaborate explanation at this point. "I missed my train stop and I'm stranded until the 27th. I have money enough for the ticket but not for lodging, and I'm willing to work for it." The room had gone quiet in the way that rooms went quiet when something interesting was happening. Several of the men were grinning. One of them said something to his neighbor in a low voice and got a laugh in return. "This ain't a hotel," the bartender said. "I can see that. And we don't hire women." "So you've said, in so many words." A man near the end of the bar, heavy with drink and heavy with himself, leaned over and said, "I got a room. Cost you nothing." He said it with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told what he could do with his offer. "I appreciate your generosity," Claire said, "but no." More laughter. She turned to leave and someone near the door said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That one come off the train half-hour ago. Nobody in town will take her in. Something wrong with her, you ask me." She walked out without answering. There was no answer worth giving. She had been in Black Hollow for an hour and a quarter when she sat down on the steps of the dark doctor's office and tried to think through her situation with some clarity. She was cold. She was going to get colder. The storm that Greta Holst had mentioned was not a rumor anymore. It was arriving, thickening the air and piling snow against the buildings in ways that were beginning to look permanent. Her coat was good wool, but it was not made for this kind of exposure, and she could feel the temperature in her feet going from unpleasant to something more worrying. She had $4.30. She had a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, a change of underlinen, a hairbrush, and a copy of a novel she'd read twice on the train. She had a letter from Mrs. Harriet Fowler that nobody in this town was going to care about, and she had the beginnings of a problem she didn't know how to solve. She was not prone to panic. She'd grown up in circumstances that hadn't left much room for it. A father who'd died of something lung-related when she was 11. A mother who'd worked herself thin keeping them from the poorhouse. A succession of jobs since she was 14 that had all paid poorly, and some of them had been unpleasant in other ways too. She knew what it was to be cold and tired and without obvious options. She'd managed those things before, but she'd managed them in St. Louis, where there were always other streets to try, other people to approach, some thread of connection that led somewhere. Black Hollow was 33 buildings and a population of, at most, a few hundred people, and she had tried all the threads available and they had all led nowhere. She pulled her coat tighter and watched the snow come down. She heard the wagon before she saw it. The particular creak and jingle of a team being driven carefully on an icy street, and the low sound of a man speaking to horses in the way that people who spent a lot of time with horses learned to speak, steadily and without drama. The wagon came around the corner from the direction of the livery, loaded with something under canvas, and the man driving it had his hat pulled low against the weather. He might have driven straight past her. He was clearly headed somewhere specific, with purpose in the set of his shoulders, and she was just a woman sitting on some steps in a storm. But he pulled the horses up. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat for a moment. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, she thought, lean and weathered in the way of men who worked outdoors. His face was not unkind exactly. It was careful, like someone who'd learned to look at things twice before drawing conclusions. "You all right?" he said. It was such a straightforward question that for a moment she almost didn't know how to answer it. Everyone else she'd spoken to in the last hour had led with their reasons for not helping. This man had simply asked whether she was all right. "No," she said. "Not particularly." He looked at her for another moment. "What's the trouble?" She told him, briefly, the train, the wrong stop, the next westbound being 3 days off, the failed attempts to find shelter. She didn't embellish it. She was too cold and too tired to embellish. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Where in Dalton Creek?" he said. "A family named Fowler. I have a letter of employment from them. Housekeeping. I was due to start on the 26th. He shifted the reins in his hands. The horses were restless in the wind, stamping and blowing steam. "Fowler?" he repeated, like he was checking it against something. "Don't know them, but Dalton Creek's not where I'm headed. I've got a ranch about 6 miles out of here, northeast." "Oh," Clara said. "Storm's going to be bad tonight," he said. "Possibly the next couple of days." He paused. "I've got a spare room. It's nothing, but it's got 4 walls and a door and it's not outside." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them was smiling. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "My name is Wade Mercer. I run the Mercer Ranch about 6 miles northeast. You can ask anyone in town, ask Tom Adler at the livery or the Yanceys at the store. They'll tell you I exist." "I already spoke to Tom Adler," Clara said. "His manners leave something to be desired." Something shifted in the man's expression. Not quite a smile, but the precondition for one. "Yeah," he said. "That's Tom." She sat there for another moment, weighing it. She had been a reasonably good judge of people since she was about 12 years old, not from any special gift, but from necessity. When you had to read rooms and intentions quickly, you got better at it. The man on the wagon seat above her had made no offer that required anything from her. He hadn't looked at her the way Tom Adler had looked at her. He wasn't trying to be charming. He was just stating facts in a flat, practical voice and waiting. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I'll take it." He nodded like that was the expected outcome and not a surprise either way. "Can you climb up?" She could. She hauled herself up onto the wagon seat with less grace than she would have preferred and settled her bag on her knees. He clicked to the horses and they moved off down the street into the snow, and that was that. No ceremony. No further conversation for the first few minutes. "I'm Clara Bennett," she said after they'd turned off the main street. "All right," he said. "I'm not a difficult person," she said. "I'll try to stay out of your way." He looked at the road ahead. Wasn't worried about that. The road from town to the Mercer Ranch was not technically a road. It was a direction, suggested by the land and confirmed by the ruts of previous travel, most of which were filling in rapidly with new snow. Wade drove with the particular attention of someone who knew where he was going by memory as much as by sight, and Clara sat beside him and watched the darkness resolve itself into shapes. The suggestion of hills, the darker mass of trees, the occasional fence post trailing into the white nothing of the blizzard. She was warming up, slowly. Not warm. The cold was still in her feet and her hands, and the wind off the mountains was not interested in the windbreak provided by the wagon seat, but better. Alive in the way that required active effort, rather than the passive way that could lead to other things. "Do you have family at the ranch?" she asked, at some point, because silence was fine, but the particular quality of this silence felt like something that needed addressing. He took a moment to answer. "A daughter," he said. "Emma. She's 8. "And a wife?" The pause this time was different in character. "No," he said. "Not anymore." "I'm sorry," Clara said. He nodded, looking at the road. She didn't ask more about it. She had the sense that the information had cost something to produce, and that more questions would cost more than he was prepared to pay at the moment. Instead, she asked about the road and the snow, and how often this kind of storm came through. And he answered all of those things in the same measured way. Not unfriendly, not warm, just present and practical, giving her information as it was asked for. The ranch came into view after what Clara judged to be about 40 minutes of travel, though she'd lost track of time somewhat in the cold. It was a low house with a longer building to the side of it, the barn, she guessed, and a few smaller structures clustered around. Light showed in 2 of the house's windows, and smoke came from the chimney, and Clara Bennett, who had been sitting on the steps of a dark doctor's office in a blizzard an hour ago, felt something in her chest ease by a degree that surprised her. "Someone's home," she said. "Mrs. Teague," he said. "She sits with Emma when I go into town. She'll be heading back to her place soon as I'm back." He paused. "It's just Emma and me out here normally." He said it without self-pity, just information. The inside of the Mercer house was warm, which was the first thing. The second thing was that it was clean but spare. Furniture that was functional rather than comfortable. Walls that had been unpainted long enough that the wood had gone its own color. A kitchen that had the equipment for cooking but not much in the way of decoration. It was a house that someone lived in without particularly inhabiting. There was a difference, Clara had found, and this house knew it. Mrs. Teague was a round woman, 50s, with an apron and an expression of watchful curiosity. She looked at Clara with the directness of someone who was going to form an opinion and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "This is Miss Bennett," Wade said. "She missed her train stop. She'll be using the spare room until the service resumes." Mrs. Teague said, in a tone that contained a complete sentence worth of inference. "Where's Emma?" Wade said. "Asleep already. She was out on that porch half the afternoon watching for you, wore herself out." Mrs. Teague pulled her wrap off the peg by the door. "I'll be going. Roads aren't going to get better for waiting." She paused at the door and looked at Clara one more time. "You need anything, Miss Bennett? I'm at the Teague place about 2 miles south, though not tonight in this." "Thank you," Clara said. Mrs. Teague went out. The door closed. Wade put another log on the fire without speaking, and the house settled into a silence that was different from the cold silence of the blizzard. This one had warmth in it, the small sounds of burning wood and the wind pushing against the walls. "Kitchen's there," Wade said. "Help yourself to whatever's in the larder. There's a bread she made this morning." He picked up the lamp from the table. "I'll show you the room." The spare room was small, a bed with a quilted cover, a washstand, a window that showed nothing but the storm outside. It smelled of dust and old wood and disuse. Wade set the lamp on the washstand and stood in the doorway. "It'll do," Clara said. "Thank you, genuinely." He looked at her for a moment with that same careful expression she'd noticed in the street, like he was looking at something he hadn't fully categorized yet. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Nobody should be out there tonight." He pulled the door most of the way shut behind him. Clara sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, listening to the wind outside and the creak of the house settling against it. She was warm. She had 4 walls. She had a door that closed. For the moment, that was more than she'd had an hour ago, and she tried to be present enough to notice it. She unpacked her bag methodically. Her dresses hung on the pegs behind the door, her underthings folded in the washstand drawer, her novel on the bedside ledge. She was tired, but the kind of tired that had too much adrenaline underneath it for actual sleep. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the house. After a while, she heard a sound she hadn't expected. Small feet on floorboards, and then a pause outside her door, the particular hesitation of a child deciding whether to knock or not. Clara waited. The knock, when it came, was barely a knock, more of a tap. "Come in," Clara said. The door opened a few inches and a face appeared in the gap. A girl, small for 8, with her father's careful eyes and hair that had been braided at some point during the day and was now mostly unbridled. She was wearing a flannel nightgown that was too long for her, and she was looking at Clara with the particular intensity of a child who hadn't decided yet whether to be afraid. "Hello," Clara said. The girl didn't say anything. "I'm Clara. I missed my train stop. Your father was kind enough to let me stay the night." Still nothing, but the door opened a little wider. "It's very cold out there," Clara said conversationally. "I'm glad to be inside. Are you glad to be inside?" The girl looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded, a small, careful nod. "That's good," Clara said. "I think being inside in a storm is one of the better things." She paused. "You must be Emma." Another nod. Clara waited, giving her the space. "You don't have to stay," she said after a moment. "If you were heading somewhere, I just thought I'd say hello." Emma stood in the doorway for a few more seconds. Then, without any particular announcement, she came in and sat in the room's one chair, the small wooden one in the corner, and looked at Clara with those steady eyes. "All right," Clara said. "That's all right." They sat there for a while, not speaking, while the storm worked at the walls outside. Clara wasn't sure what to make of the child's silence. Not shy, exactly, more like someone who had been very careful for a long time and wasn't sure yet whether to stop. There was something in Emma's face, behind the watchfulness, that Clara recognized in a general way, the look of someone waiting to see if things were going to get worse. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said quietly. Emma looked at her. "Is the snow always this serious here, or is tonight special?" Something moved in Emma's face. Not a smile quite, but something in the vicinity. She held up 2 fingers, then shrugged, sometimes 2 days, sometimes not. "That's a lot of snow," Clara said. Emma nodded. They stayed like that for another few minutes, until the sound of Wade's boots on the floor stopped outside the door. "Emma," he said, his voice quiet through the wood, "you ought to be sleeping." The girl looked at the door, then at Clara, then back at the door. She stood up from the chair slowly, like she was being careful not to tip anything over, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. Then she looked back at Clara once more, and for a single moment her expression was different from everything it had been, direct and unguarded, asking something that didn't have words yet. Clara held it steadily. "Good night, Emma," she said. Emma went. Trumped. Clara lay awake longer than she meant to, listening to the storm in the house. The wind was serious now. She could hear it finding the gaps in the walls, whistling through places where wood had shrunk away from wood over years of winters. The house was old enough to talk back to it, settling and creaking in a way that would have been unnerving if she hadn't been so tired. She thought about Mrs. Fowler in Dalton Creek, who didn't know where she was. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket. She would need to telegram when the storm let up and the office opened again. Christmas Day, probably, the message would go unsent. She thought about Emma's face in the doorway and the question in her eyes that hadn't found words yet. She thought about Wade Mercer, who had stopped a wagon in a blizzard for a stranger sitting on some steps, without drama or ceremony, and offered 4 walls and a door because nobody should be out there alone. He hadn't made anything of it. He'd stated it the way you stated weather, as a simple fact about conditions. She fell asleep to the sound of the storm, warmer than she'd been in hours. The next morning, Christmas Day, the world outside the Mercer house was white and still. The storm had done its work in the night and retired, leaving behind a landscape so altered that Clara stood at the kitchen window for a long moment before she could sort out where the fence had been. She had been up before anyone else, which was a habit from years of employment, and before that from a childhood where sleeping late was a luxury that didn't exist. She had found wood beside the kitchen stove and got the fire going before she fully understood that she'd done it. And then she'd stood in the kitchen and assessed the larder with the kind of eyes that were trained on what was there rather than what wasn't. There was flour, lard, dried apples, salt pork, a small quantity of sugar, cornmeal, potatoes going a little soft in the root bin. There was Mrs. Teague's bread from the previous day, already firming up. She started breakfast. She wasn't sure why she did it exactly. It wasn't her kitchen, and she hadn't been asked. But the house had a particular emptiness to it at that hour. Not the comfortable emptiness of a place where someone was simply asleep nearby, but the kind that comes from a household that has been operating below the minimum for a while. The kind that was harder to name than hunger or cold, but was real in the same way. The biscuits were done when she heard the creak of a door and then the padding of small feet. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, hair worse than it had been the night before, and stopped when she saw Clara at the stove. She looked at the biscuits. She looked at Clara. "Good morning," Clara said. "Merry Christmas." Emma came into the kitchen cautiously, like she was approaching something that might startle. She pulled out the chair at the table, the closer one, and sat in it, watching Clara move from the stove to the counter and back. "Do you like dried apple?" Clara asked. Emma considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved, and then nodded. "Good, because that's what we have. Your father get up early?" Emma pointed at the window, at the outside. "He's already at the barn," Clara said. "Nod. On Christmas morning, that's dedication." Something happened around Emma's mouth, not quite a smile yet, but it was practicing. Wade came in from the barn with cold and hay on his coat and the look of a man who'd been up for a while attending to things that didn't observe Christmas. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scene. Emma at the table, Clara at the stove, the smell of biscuits, and something approaching normalcy. With an expression Clara could only describe as careful. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Do you take coffee when you can get it?" "There should be some in the—" "Found it," she said. "Sit down. You've been outside since before the sun." He stood in the doorway for another moment, then came in and hung his coat and sat at the table across from Emma. Emma looked at him. He looked back at Emma with the specific helplessness of a father who loves his child completely and knows it's not always enough. Clara set the coffee down in front of him without comment. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "You were kind last night. This is nothing." He wrapped his hands around the mug and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Do you always get up this early?" "When there's reason to," Clara said. "Usually there's reason." Emma reached across the table and tugged once on her father's sleeve, pointing at the biscuits. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I see them." They ate breakfast on Christmas Day in the quiet of a house held in by snow, and it was not comfortable exactly, and it was not easy, but it was something. Clara didn't try to make more of it than it was. She asked about the ranch when conversation seemed appropriate and stayed quiet when it didn't. She watched Emma watch her father, and she watched Wade try to find the right way to sit in a kitchen that smelled like someone was living in it. After breakfast, Emma disappeared to her room and came back with a small stuffed horse, lopsided, with mismatched button eyes. She set it on the table in front of Clara without explanation. "Is that for me to look at?" Clara said. Emma sat down across from her and folded her hands. She's very distinguished, Clara said, examining the horse. What's her name? Emma took a piece of paper from her pocket. She'd apparently planned this, and wrote one word and pushed it across the table. Pepper. Pepper, Clara said. That's an excellent name. She set the horse back down between them with care. Does she go everywhere with you? Emma took the paper back and wrote, most places. Clara nodded, like this was completely reasonable, which it was. Across the kitchen, Wade stood at the window with his coffee, watching the snow, and said nothing. The afternoon of Christmas Day, 1885, at the Mercer Ranch was quiet. In the way that places are quiet when they've been alone a long time and aren't sure what to do with company. Clara didn't push. She mended a rip in her traveling dress that had been bothering her since St. Louis. She looked through the small collection of books on the shelf in the main room, most of them practical. An almanac, a guide to livestock management, something about soil, and found, at the end, a copy of fairy tales worn soft with reading. She brought it to where Emma was sitting near the fire and held it up. Emma looked at it, then at Clara, then took it and opened it to a page in the middle with the familiarity of something visited many times. They sat beside the fire in the afternoon of Christmas Day, Clara reading aloud and Emma following along with her finger. And outside, the snow reflected the low winter sun in a way that made everything look like it was holding still, just for now. At some point, Wade came in and sat in the chair near the window, far enough away not to intrude, close enough to hear the reading. He stayed there until Clara finished the story and closed the book. And then he got up and went to see about supper without saying anything, which was its own kind of saying something. The next 2 days were variations on that same quiet. The storm came back in a smaller version of itself on the 26th, pinning them inside again, and the roads were deep enough the 27th that it was clear no train was running. Clara telegraphed Mrs. Fowler when she could get to the station office, a note through a boy Wade sent to town, and received back a message that was warm and understanding and said to come when the roads allowed. She felt something uncomfortable when she read it, which she examined later and identified as reluctance. Not at going to Dalton Creek. She still needed to go, still needed the work, still had a plan. But the reluctance was real, and she was honest enough with herself not to pretend it wasn't. On the evening of the 26th, she taught Emma how to make cornbread. She stood beside her at the counter, letting the girl measure the cornmeal with serious concentration. And Emma's tongue came out a little at the corner of her mouth when she was getting the measurement right. And Clara found herself standing there looking at the side of this child's face with something that felt too large for the moment. Emma looked up. She'd noticed Clara looking. Sorry, Clara said. I was just thinking you've got a very good hand for measuring. Emma didn't smile, but she looked at Clara for a moment the way you looked at something you'd decided was probably safe. Later, when the cornbread was in the oven and they were waiting, Emma sat at the table with her paper and wrote something and pushed it to Clara. Are you staying? Clara looked at the words. She looked at Emma, who was watching her with that patient, direct gaze. I have to go to Dalton Creek, Clara said. When the roads open, I have a job waiting there. Emma looked at the paper. Then she took the pencil and wrote one more word. Oh. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket and didn't write anything else that evening. That night, Clara lay in the spare room and listened to the house and thought about the word "oh," written in a child's careful hand, folded and pocketed. She thought about the space between what a person needed to do and what a person wanted to do, which was sometimes a very small space and sometimes an enormous one, and how you navigated it was one of the things that made you who you were. She didn't have an answer. She had a job in Dalton Creek and $4.30 and a letter from a woman she'd never met. And that was what she'd had when she got on the train, and it was still what she had. Wade Mercer's spare room was not her life. Emma Mercer was not her responsibility. She told herself these things in the way that you told yourself things you needed to believe, and pulled the quilt up and listened to the wind, which had come back around and was pushing at the walls again with the patient, impersonal persistence of weather that had no interest in anyone's arrangements. Outside, Black Hollow sat under 2 feet of new snow, and the rumors were already starting. About the woman at Mercer's ranch, about what she was doing there, about what a woman alone at a widower's house on Christmas could possibly mean. Small towns had a particular appetite for that kind of speculation, and Black Hollow was no exception. It was the kind of place where the story got ahead of the facts, and the facts rarely caught up. Clara didn't know about the rumors yet. But the town was already writing her story for her, and it bore very little resemblance to the one she was living. The roads didn't open on the 27th. Clara had known they wouldn't. She'd seen enough of the snow from the kitchen window that morning to understand that the drifts along the northeastern road were not going anywhere in a hurry, and the temperature, if anything, had dropped overnight into a range that turned breath to vapor the instant you stepped outside. Wade confirmed it without ceremony at breakfast. The road into Black Hollow was buried past the second fence post, which meant impassable by wagon, which meant she was staying another day, whether she'd planned to or not. "I'll send word to Mrs. Fowler again," Clara said. "I'll have the boy take a note when I go check the fence line," Wade said. He was already in his coat, already thinking about the outside work that waited regardless of weather. "He can go on foot through the north field if the drifts aren't too deep." "Thank you," Clara said. He nodded and went out. Emma sat at the table eating her porridge with the slow deliberateness of a child who was thinking about something other than eating. She'd been that way since she'd woken. Not sad, exactly, just internal. Clara had noticed, over the past 3 days, that Emma had moods that moved through her like weather, and the best thing to do was not try to interrupt them. So Clara cleaned up the breakfast things and didn't try to make conversation. And after a while, Emma finished her porridge and brought her bowl to the counter and stood beside Clara while she washed up, handing her things to be dried without being asked. "You've done this before," Clara said. Emma looked at the bowl she was holding. "Helping in the kitchen," Clara said. "You know where things go." Emma shrugged, a small, one-shouldered thing. Then she went and got her paper and pencil from the windowsill, where she'd apparently established a permanent station for them, and wrote, "Mama taught me." Clara dried the bowl carefully. "She sounds like she was a good teacher." Emma looked at the paper for a moment, then turned it over and put it face down on the counter. Some things weren't for writing more about. Clara recognized that and didn't push. The morning passed the way mornings did when you were snowbound, slowly, with odd pockets of unexpected industry. Clara found a basket of mending in the corner of the main room, the kind of basket that accumulates when no one has the time or inclination to deal with it, and she sat by the fire and worked through it without asking anyone's permission. There were shirts of Wade's with buttons missing, a pair of work trousers split at a seam, and several items of Emma's: a wool stocking with a hole worn through the heel, a dress with a torn hem, a small cotton apron that had been through something abrasive. Clara fixed them in order of practical urgency, and Emma sat nearby and watched her work with that attentive, still quality that had stopped being unnerving and had started being just Emma. "Do you want to try?" Clara said, at some point, holding out the needle and a length of thread. Emma considered it. Then she came and sat beside Clara, and Clara showed her the stitch. Simple, just an overcast, guiding her hand through the first few loops. Emma's initial attempts were uneven, pulling too tight and then too loose, the line of thread going diagonal when it should have gone straight. She frowned at it. "That's how it looks the first time," Clara said. "And the second. It gets less interesting looking after a while." Emma looked at her sideways, something flickering in her expression. "I mean, it gets better," Clara clarified. "Less character. More useful." Emma bent over the mending again, and the frown came back, but it was a different kind of frown. The working kind. The kind that meant she was in it. Wade came in from the fence line at midday looking cold in the bone-deep way that had nothing to do with how many layers you wore. He stood by the kitchen stove for a while, not speaking, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug Clara had ready, and Clara gave him the space to thaw out before she said anything. "How bad is the fence?" she finally asked. 3 posts down on the north pasture. Storm pushed a drift against it, and the weight took them. He set the mug down. "Cattle are all right, counted them this morning." "How many do you run?" 63 head. He paused. "Used to be more." Clara didn't ask what that meant. She had a sense that it was one of those sentences with a longer story behind it, and that the longer story wasn't necessarily for today. What she'd gathered from the past 3 days of proximity and careful observation was that the Mercer Ranch was a place running on reduced circumstances. Not desperate, not failing, not in obvious distress, but trimmed down from something larger. The barn had stalls that stood empty. The hooks in the tack room had fewer things hanging on them than the arrangement of the hooks suggested had once hung there. Wade worked from before sunrise to well into the evening, and he worked alone. There was no hired hand that she'd seen, no mention of one. And the house itself, She thought about this at odd moments, when she was fixing something or moving something or simply standing in a room. It wasn't that it was neglected, it was clean, in the functional sense. Things worked. The stove drew properly, the well rope was in good repair, the windows had been sealed against the weather. But there was an absence of the small things that people accumulated when they were actually living somewhere. No curtains, no pictures on the walls, no evidence of decoration attempted or even considered. A vase that had probably held flowers once, standing empty on the kitchen shelf. A tablecloth that had been washed so many times it was going thin at the fold lines, kept not because it was still useful, but because getting rid of it would be a different kind of decision. It was a house that had stopped trying in some particular way, and she couldn't tell if Wade knew it or not. Emma knew it. Clara was becoming more certain of this. The child moved through the house with a careful deference to its stillness, like she'd understood early that her presence needed to be quiet, needed not to take up too much space. She didn't run. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't bring the natural chaos of childhood into a house that seemed unable to accommodate it. She had made herself small in a way that 8-year-olds shouldn't need to make themselves small. Clara thought about this while she started on lunch, and she thought about Emma's careful hand pushing a folded paper across the table. "Are you staying?" And she thought about how much a question like that cost a child who'd learned to be careful about what she asked for. On the 4th day, Clara reorganized the kitchen. She didn't announce it. She simply looked at the arrangement of things. The pots hung too far from the stove, the staples stored in a sequence that made no practical sense, the good cutting board stuck behind something that was never used and was taking up prime counter space. And she moved things. She moved them with the efficiency of someone who has thought about kitchen logistics for most of her working life. And by the time Wade came in at noon, the room was the same room but functionally different. He stopped in the doorway. "I moved some things," Clara said. He looked around. "I can see that. I can put it back if you prefer." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Does it work better?" "Yes." "Leave it then." That was the whole of it. But that evening, when he was making the coffee and didn't have to turn around 3 times to find the sugar, she caught him registering it, the small ease of a thing being where it should be, without comment. She also aired out the spare room that had been used for storing things that didn't have anywhere better to be, and she found the small collection of Emma's books mixed in with the storage and put them on the shelf in Emma's room where they belonged. She repaired the latch on the kitchen shutter that had been banging loose in the wind. She found a loose floorboard near the front door and set it right with a nail and a boot heel, which was an inelegant solution, but a working one. She didn't do these things to impress anyone. She did them because they needed doing, and she was there, and she had the capability. This was a straightforward thing in her mind. When you saw something that needed fixing, and you could fix it, you fixed it. It was Emma who seemed most affected. The girl had developed a habit of following Clara at a slight distance. Not so close as to be in the way, but close enough to watch what she was doing. Clara narrated as she worked, not self-consciously but naturally, explaining what she was doing and why, describing the logic of the thing, the same way Clara's own mother had talked her through tasks when she was small. Emma never asked questions out loud, but her face asked them constantly, and Clara answered the ones she could read. "The reason you hang the heavier pots closest to the stove," Clara said one afternoon, while Emma watched from her chair with Pepper the lopsided horse in her lap, "is that when they're full, you don't want to be carrying them far. Saves about 20 trips a week that you don't even notice you're making." Emma looked at the reorganized pot hooks. "Your mother probably knew that," Clara said. "Most women who cook know that. I just put it back where it should be." Emma looked down at Pepper. She stroked one of the button eyes with her thumb, deliberate and small. Then she wrote on her paper without looking up. She used to sing while she cooked. Clara put down what she was holding. What did she sing? Emma thought about this for a moment. Then she wrote, "I don't remember all of it, just the sound." "That's the important part," Clara said quietly. "The sound lasts longer than the words." Emma didn't write anything else, but she stayed in the kitchen until supper was ready, and while Clara cooked, she was very still, like she was listening for something. Wade was not a man who talked much, and the talking he did was usually functional. Information conveyed, questions answered, decisions stated. Clara had grown accustomed to this. She'd been around people a few words before and had no particular problem with it. What she'd also noticed was that the few words he did spend were usually precise, not curt. He wasn't unfriendly, he just didn't fill silence with noise. There was a difference. But by the 5th day, she was beginning to detect, underneath the quiet, something that might have been curiosity. He'd started asking her small questions in the evenings. Not personal, not probing, but present. Where had she learned to make the dried apple compote she'd served 2 nights ago? Whether she'd always been good at fixing things. How she'd found her way to the employment advertisement from Dalton Creek. She answered them the same way he answered hers, directly, without more than was asked. "My mother," she said, about the compote. She could make something out of nothing. Growing up, we didn't have a lot of the something part, so she got good at it. And the fixing things? Same answer, roughly. If something broke and we couldn't afford to replace it, you figured out how to fix it. You do it enough, you get competent. It's not a skill so much as a response to circumstances. He was quiet for a moment. They were sitting at opposite ends of the kitchen table, the lamp between them, the fire low. Emma had gone to bed an hour ago, and the house had the particular quality it always got after Emma was asleep. Not quieter exactly, but differently weighted. "Where are your family now?" he asked. "My mother passed 4 years ago," Clara said. "My father when I was 11. No siblings." She said this without particular drama. It was just the geography of her life. "You? Parents are gone. Brother in Kansas." He paused. "We don't talk much." "Brothers can be that way?" Claire said. "Can be," he agreed. She looked at her hands on the table. She'd been meaning to ask something for 2 days, and she wasn't sure this was the right moment, but the conversation had gotten here of its own accord. "Emma," she said. "She hasn't spoken since her mother died," he said. 14 months ago. He was looking at the fire. "Doctor in Cheyenne said it was—" He stopped, started again. He had a word for it, the kind that means there's nothing wrong with her throat. He paused. She just stopped. "Has she ever written to you?" Clara said. "The way she does with me?" He was quiet for a moment that went on long enough that she thought she'd asked the wrong thing. Then, "Some. She's writing more lately." Clara let that sit. "She talks to you," he said, and the way he said it was not an accusation and not quite gratitude. It was more like the acknowledgement of a fact he'd had to turn over a few times before he could hold it right. "I know it's not, she doesn't use her voice, but she's talking. She has things to say," Clara said. "She's just been choosing carefully who's worth saying them to." He looked at her then. She met it steadily. "She chose right before," he said, finally. "With her mother." He looked back at the fire. "After, she didn't choose anyone for a long time." The fire popped. Outside, the wind was still doing its patient work against the walls. "She gave me Pepper to look at," Clara said. "The first night. That felt like trust." "It was," he said simply. On the 6th day, the Yancey boy from town showed up on horseback in the early afternoon with a bundle of supplies Wade had ordered before the storm, and a look of elaborate unconcern that told Clara he'd been sent partly to deliver the supplies and partly to gather information. He was maybe 15, round-cheeked, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, trying not to stare at Clara in a way that suggested he was going to stare at Clara all the way back to town in his memory. "Everything all right out here?" he said to Wade, who was checking through the bundle. "Fine," Wade said. "My ma wanted me to ask," the boy said, which was enough for Clara to understand that it was the whole town wanting to ask, routed politely through maternal concern. "Miss Bennett is waiting for the road to Dalton Creek to clear," Wade said, without inflection. "She'll be moving on when it does." The boy nodded, still not quite not staring at Clara. Clara gave him a composed look that she'd developed over years of being stared at in various situations, and he suddenly found the hat in his hands very interesting. "Merry Christmas," Clara said. "Belated." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and got back on his horse. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and she knew with the kind of knowledge that comes from having lived among people all your life, that whatever he reported back would be the story the town was working with, and that the story the town was working with was already something other than what had actually happened. She'd been in Black Hollow for 6 days. By the reckoning of a small frontier town, she had been living at a widower's ranch for 6 days without a chaperone, which was a fact open to interpretation, and small towns preferred interpretations that generated conversation. She didn't say any of this to Wade. He likely knew it already. What she said was, "I can go into town tomorrow if the road's better. Let people see I'm unremarkable." He looked at her. "You don't need to manage what people think." "I know I don't need to," she said, "but I also know how it works." He was quiet for a moment. "If the road clears," he said, "we can go together. I have to see the blacksmith about a part for the pump." "All right," she said. It wasn't agreement, exactly, and it wasn't a statement about what either of them thought the town should make of their going together. It was just practical. The road cleared partially on the 7th day. They went into town together, Wade driving, Emma sitting between them on the wagon seat because she'd refused to be left at home, with a look of such clear, silent determination that Wade had simply moved over to make room. Clara had watched this negotiation with interest. Emma won most of them, it turned out, when she felt strongly enough, and she won them without a word. Black Hollow on the 2nd day of January looked like a town that had been roughed up and was reconsidering its position on winter. Snow was piled in configurations that had nothing to do with where it had originally fallen, and the few people on the street were moving with the purposeful speed of those who had things to do inside and were merely transiting. Clara felt eyes on them as Wade pulled the wagon up to the blacksmith's. Not obvious staring, just the particular awareness of a small place that noticed arrivals. She helped Emma down from the wagon, and they walked together to the general store while Wade went to the blacksmith. Inside, the Yancey woman, presumably the boy's mother, stood behind the counter with a neighbor, and both of them stopped talking the instant Clara and Emma came through the door with the abruptness of people who'd been talking about the person who just walked in. "Good morning," Clara said. "Good morning," said Mrs. Yancey with the careful pleasantness of someone deciding on a tone. Her eyes moved to Emma. Something softened a little. "Emma, sweetheart, how are you?" Emma gave a small nod. "She's been well," Clara said. "We've all been well, thank you." The neighbor, Clara didn't have a name for her yet, a thin woman with sharp, curious eyes, said, "That was quite a storm, wasn't it? Dreadful thing, being stranded." "It was inconvenient, yes," Clara said. She was looking at the shelves, making a mental list. "Do you carry needles, the finer gauge?" "Third shelf, left side," Mrs. Yancey said, and the deliberate practicality of the question seemed to have the effect Clara had intended, moving things from the territory of gossip into the territory of commerce. Emma stood beside Clara at the shelf and studied the needles with the same concentration she brought to most things. Clara let her pick the packet. Behind them, the neighbor said quietly but not quietly enough, "She's very comfortable with the child, isn't she?" Clara chose not to hear it. She took the needles to the counter and paid for them, and she bought a small paper of lemon drops because Emma had looked at them twice and hadn't said anything, which was a kind of saying something. On the walk back to the blacksmith, Clara gave Emma the paper of lemon drops without comment. Emma looked at them, then looked at Clara, then took one with the careful deliberateness of a child trying to decide how much to show she was pleased. She put it in her mouth, and the corner of her mouth went up in the smallest possible degree. "You're welcome," Clara said, even though Emma hadn't said thank you. Emma wrote in the air with her finger, a gesture Clara had seen before and was starting to decode, a kind of shorthand for "I know" or "I understand." "I know you know," Clara said. "That's enough." Wade finished with the blacksmith and they started back through town, and it was on the main street, just before the wagon, that Clara heard it clearly enough not to be able to pretend she hadn't. Two women on the sidewalk, close enough. "Can't imagine what Mercer is thinking, keeping a strange woman out there with the child." "Well, you know it's been a long time since he had—" Clara walked past them at the same pace she'd been walking. Emma's hand had found her coat sleeve somewhere in the last 30 seconds, not holding it, just touching it, the way children touch things for reassurance without wanting to admit they needed reassurance. "Don't mind them," Clara said quietly, not turning her head. Emma wrote in the air again, a different gesture this time. Clara was still learning the alphabet of it. "I don't know what you wrote," Clara said. "Tell me later." Emma let go of her sleeve when they reached the wagon and climbed up with the self-sufficiency that she deployed whenever she thought someone might be about to help her. Clara climbed up after her. Wade came around from the far side with the pump part, loaded it in the back without speaking, and they drove out of town. No one said anything about the women on the sidewalk. There was nothing useful to say about them. That evening, while Clara was banking the fire for the night, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway and showed her the paper. They talk about you. Yes, Clara said. I know. Does it hurt? Clara looked at that word, hurt, in the child's handwriting. She thought about how to answer it honestly. Sometimes, she said, less than it used to. Emma wrote, Mama said it means they have nothing better to think about. Clara was quiet for a moment. Your mother was right, she said. Emma looked at the paper. Then she wrote slowly, I miss her. I know you do, Clara said. That doesn't go away, but it changes. Give it time. Emma folded the paper. She stood there for a moment in the doorway, small and serious in her nightgown, and then she crossed the kitchen and, without warning or preamble, put her arms around Clara's waist and held on. Clara stood very still. Then she put her hand on the back of Emma's head carefully and held her there while the fire popped and the wind came around the corner of the house and found nothing new to say. After a minute, Emma let go and went to bed. Clara stood at the fire for a long time after. The letter from Mrs. Fowler in Dalton Creek arrived on the 9th day. Delivered through Wade's informal system of town communication, the Yancey boy again, who had apparently accepted his role as courier with the resigned professionalism of the perpetually appointed. The letter was brief and warm and said that circumstances in the Fowler household had shifted somewhat, and while Mrs. Fowler still hoped to have Clara's services, she would understand if there was a delay of another week given the road conditions, and she would hold the position. Clara read it twice. She was in the kitchen. Through the window, she could see Emma outside in the yard, doing the things she'd started doing in the afternoons, walking the perimeter of the fence with the deliberateness of a much older person, pepper stuffed in her coat pocket with one lopsided ear sticking out. She was talking. Clara could see her mouth moving, which was something she'd never done inside the house. Out there, alone with the cold and the fence and Pepper, she was talking. Clara had mentioned this to Wade the previous evening, very carefully. He'd been quiet for a long time. Then, she does that, since winter. I didn't know you'd seen it. Is it always outside? Always alone, he said, or what she thinks is alone. I think that's how she's keeping the words from going altogether, Clara said, practicing somewhere safe. He'd looked at the table for a while, then, yeah, he said, I think so too. He'd paused. The doctor in Cheyenne said, eventually. That was the only thing he could offer, eventually. He's probably right, Clara said. Children find their way back. They usually do if someone waits. I'm waiting, Wade said, and the way he said it, flat and factual and carrying 14 months of weight, made Clara stop talking for a while. She looked at the letter from Mrs. Fowler now and thought about eventually. Then she went to find Wade, who was in the barn doing the afternoon work on the stalls. He was forking hay when she came in, and he stopped when he saw her face. Letter from Fowler, she said. She'll hold the position another week. He nodded, looking at the pitchfork in his hands. Road'll be clear in 2-3 days if it holds. I know, Clara said. He looked at her. I'm not asking for anything, she said, quickly. I just wanted you to know the situation. All right, he said. She started to turn. Clara, he said. She stopped. He was looking at the middle distance, at the space between the wall and somewhere else, in the way he had when he was choosing his words with unusual care. You've been good for her, he said. I wanted to say that. I haven't said it. Clara looked at the barn floor. The hay. The ordinary, specific details of a place that worked for a living. She's been good for me too, she said. Children usually are. He didn't say anything else. She went back to the house. Yeah. On the 10th day, the temperature lifted by a degree that was only significant if you spent a lot of time outside, but Wade said the top layer of the drifts was going sugary, which meant a thaw was working its way down, and by the weekend the road should be passable. Clara received this information and said she'd begin preparing her things. She went to the spare room that evening and looked at her dress hanging on the peg and her underthings in the drawer and her novel on the bedside ledge and the small shape the room had taken in 10 days of her being in it. It was funny how quickly a space absorbed a person. The pillow had the indent of her head, The washstand had her brush and the small bar of soap she'd brought. Pepper was sitting on the windowsill. Emma had put her there 3 days ago and never retrieved her, and Clara had been careful not to move her. She looked at Pepper on the windowsill for a long moment. She began slowly to take down her dress. The following morning, she was teaching Emma to braid. The girl had asked, not in words, but by sitting in front of Clara with her hair loose and a look of patient expectancy, when Wade came in from outside faster than his usual pace. He came into the kitchen, and Clara looked up, and something in his face was different from his ordinary expression, which was already not a face that changed much. This was a different kind of still. "What is it?" she said. He held up a piece of paper. It was folded differently than her letter from Fowler. Heavier paper. Not the casual fold of private correspondence, but the deliberate crease of a business communication. "This came with the Yancey boy," he said. "Addressed to you." Clara set down the brush and took it. Emma twisted around to see, and Clara put a hand gently on her shoulder to keep her still while she opened the letter. It was from a firm called Alderman and Kress, attorneys at law, of Denver, Colorado. It was short and not warm at all. It informed Miss Clara Bennett that she was hereby notified that Mr. and Mrs. George Aldwell of St. Louis, Missouri, intended to pursue a claim of theft against her in the amount of $42 and sundry household items allegedly removed from the premises of the Aldwell household at 14 Garrison Street, St. Louis, Missouri, prior to her departure in December of 1885. The letter further advised that her current whereabouts had been communicated to the Aldwells by a party in the town of Black Hollow, and that she should expect to be contacted in person. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket, and picked up the brush and continued braiding Emma's hair. "Clara," Wade said. "I've never worked for anyone named Aldwell," she said quietly. Her hands were steady. "I don't know that name. I've never been to Garrison Street." He was looking at her. "I don't know what this is," she said, "but I know what it isn't." She finished the braid and tied it with the piece of ribbon Emma produced from her pocket. She'd apparently come prepared. And then she looked up at Wade. "Someone in this town told my whereabouts to people in St. Louis who are claiming to know me. That's the part that concerns me more than the letter." Emma had turned around. She was looking at Clara with those steady eyes, following something in the adults' faces that she understood even without words. "It's all right," Clara said to her. "It's a mistake. Mistakes get sorted out." Emma looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote in the air 2 words. Clara was getting better at reading the air writing. She thought it said, "I know," but she wasn't entirely sure. And she didn't ask for confirmation because Emma was looking at her with a directness that was past the need for clarification. The fire was low. Clara got up to add wood to it, and she did this without hurry, and her hands were steady the whole time. And she thought about who in Black Hollow might have sent her name to St. Louis. And she thought about the women on the sidewalk. And she thought about the Yancey boy with his elaborate unconcern. And she thought about all the ways a small town's appetite for story could take a wrong shape. Outside the kitchen window, the snow was still going sugary at the edges. The thaw was coming. In 2 or 3 days, the road would be open. Everything had been going quietly, carefully, reasonably well, right up until this morning. She put the letter from Alderman and Kress at the bottom of her carpet bag, under the folded dresses, which was not the same as dealing with it, but was the best she could do until she understood it better. Wade had watched her do this without comment, which she appreciated. There was nothing useful to say about a legal threat from people she'd never heard of, generated by a town that had decided it had an opinion about her, forwarded by an attorney in Denver who didn't know her from any other woman stranded by a winter storm. Words made it worse. So she put it under the dresses and went back to the ordinary work of the day, which was the only thing she knew how to do with things that couldn't be solved immediately. The road was supposed to be passable in 2 days. She kept that fact in front of her like a fixed point. That afternoon, she and Emma shelled the last of the dried beans from the storage shelf and sorted them for cooking, and Emma had developed a game out of it, racing Clara to fill her side of the bowl, cheating slightly by palming beans in a way she thought wasn't visible, which it was. Clara let her win by a reasonable margin, and Emma accepted victory with the composure of someone who suspected mercy was involved but wasn't going to look at it directly. They had gotten somewhere, Clara thought. The 2 of them. Not to anything that had a name yet, but somewhere real. Wade came in from the pasture at 5 and said the temperature had dropped again, sharply, coming off the mountains with the particular character of a second storm pushing behind the first. Not as large, he thought, but not nothing. How are the cattle? Clara asked. Moved them to the south shelter before I came in. He poured coffee. Should be all right. Emma was watching him from the table. She wrote something and pushed it to him. He read it and said, Yeah, one more day, maybe two. Then we'll see. Clara didn't ask what the note said. She stirred the beans on the stove and listened to the wind beginning to find the walls again, and she thought that winter in this part of the world was not a season so much as a character in its own right, with opinions and moods and no particular interest in human scheduling. Supper was quiet. Emma was tired from the afternoon and leaned against Wade's arm at the table in the unguarded way she sometimes did when she'd forgotten to be careful. He ate with one arm around her without making anything of it. Clara ate across from them and looked at her beans and thought about Dalton Creek and Mrs. Fowler's warm letter and the job that was waiting, and she thought about the spare room with Pepper on the windowsill, and she thought that the heart was a poorly designed instrument for situations like this one because it didn't have a practical orientation and couldn't be told what was sensible. She cleared the plates. Emma went to bed without protest, which was unusual enough that Clara paused in the doorway of the main room and looked at Wade. She go down easy? He said. Didn't argue at all, Clara said. She looked a little pale to me at supper. Did you notice? He looked toward the hallway. She's been inside a lot. Could be she's just tired. Probably, Clara said. She wasn't entirely convinced, but she also wasn't the child's mother, and she was aware that the line between genuine concern and borrowed worry was easy to cross when you'd been living alongside someone for nearly 2 weeks. She went to bed at her own hour, listened to the second storm beginning its work on the house, and told herself the girl was tired and would be fine in the morning. She woke at some point in the dark to a sound she couldn't immediately place. Not wind, not the house settling, something else. She lay still for a moment and listened. It was a cough. Small, repeated, coming through the wall. She was out of bed before she'd finished identifying it. Emma's room was at the end of the short hallway, and when Clara pushed the door open, the first thing she registered was the heat. Not the warmth of a well-covered child on a cold night. Heat, the wrong kind, the kind that came from inside a body running at a temperature it wasn't meant to reach. Emma was awake, eyes open, and she looked at Clara from the pillow with an expression that was more confused than frightened, which in some ways was worse. Clara put her hand on the child's forehead, then on her neck, then on her cheek. It was bad. She didn't know exactly how bad without a thermometer, but she'd been around sick children enough, neighbors' children, the kids at the laundry whose mothers sometimes brought them in, to know the difference between a mild fever and one that required action. All right, she said to Emma, in the voice she used when she needed to be calmer than she felt. You're going to be all right. I'm going to get your father. Emma's hand came out from under the quilt and found Clara's wrist. I'll be right back, Clara said. 2 minutes. She went across the hall and knocked once and pushed Wade's door open without waiting. He was a light sleeper, a rancher's adaptation, and he was already sitting up. Emma has a fever, Clara said. A bad one. Come now. He was in the hallway in seconds, and in Emma's doorway in seconds more, and the sound he made when he put his hand on his daughter's forehead was not quite a word. He looked at Clara. How long? He said. I don't know. She was tired at supper. I should have... Clara stopped herself. There was no use in that direction. I need to know what you have. Willow bark, quinine, anything for fever, and I need clean water and cloths. And I need to know if the doctor in town is someone who can be reached tonight. Doc Pruitt, Wade said. Other side of Black Hollow. The road... I know, Clara said. Get me what's in the house first. He went. Clara stayed with Emma and pulled the extra quilt down. Counterintuitive, but fever needed air, needed the heat to move. And spoke to her in a low, steady voice about nothing particular, about the beans they'd shelled that afternoon, about Pepper on the windowsill, about the spring thaw that would come eventually, and what the pasture probably looked like under all that snow, green and ridiculous. Emma watched her with those dark, too bright eyes and said nothing, which was not different from Emma's ordinary manner but felt completely different now. Wade came back with a tin of willow bark powder, a half-empty bottle of quinine he used for the cattle that he said the doctor had told him worked in a pinch, a basin, and a stack of dishcloths that he set down with the efficiency of a man doing things because doing things was the alternative to not being able to do anything. The road, Clara said, measuring the willow bark by eye. 2 feet of new drift on the north approach. Horse might get through, wagon won't. He was watching her hands. I could try on horseback. How long to Doc Pruitt's and back? Hour each way in this, maybe more. Clara looked at Emma. Emma's breathing was audible now, not labored exactly, but faster than it should be. What's his treatment for fever? She said. Cold compresses, willow bark, quinine if it spikes. He paused. Same as what you're doing. Then go if you can get through. If the road's worse than you think, come back. Don't get stuck out there. She said it without looking at him because she was dissolving the willow bark in a small amount of hot water, and she needed to concentrate. Can Emma swallow this if I make it weak enough? She's managed worse-tasting things. All right, go check the road. I'll be here. He left. The front door opened, and the cold came in briefly, and then the door closed, and it was just Clara and the lamp, and the child and the storm. Bamt. She worked the way she'd learned to work when something had gone wrong, and the only available resource was herself. Methodically, without the luxury of fear, doing the next thing, and then the thing after that. Cold cloth on the forehead changed when it warmed. The willow bark solution, coaxed into Emma in small sips with patience and persistence. She stripped back the bedding to just a sheet and kept the room cool enough to draw the heat out without making Emma shiver, which was a balance that required attention. She talked because Emma's eyes followed her voice, and that meant Emma was with her. And Emma being with her was the most important thing. You're going to be furious at this fever tomorrow, Clara said, wringing a cloth in the basin. You're going to wake up feeling terrible, and then a little better, and then tired for a week, and it's going to be very annoying. I know because I've been there. She laid the cloth across Emma's forehead. I had scarlet fever when I was 6. I don't remember most of it, but I remember being angry about it afterward, which my mother always said was a good sign. Anger means you're coming back. Emma's eyes tracked her. You're coming back, Clara said. I'm just letting you know. Wade came back in 40 minutes, looking like a man who'd fought something to a draw. He stamped snow from his boots in the doorway and said, Road's impassable. Horse got stuck past the second drift and I had to bring her back. All right, Clara said. Clara, it's all right, she said. We have what we need. Come in and help me. He came in and looked at his daughter, and the look on his face was the specific fear of a parent who was holding themselves together by force of understanding that falling apart would not help the child. Clara recognized it. She'd seen it on her mother's face once or twice in her own childhood, in the moments when things had gotten serious. Sit there, she said, pointing to the chair beside the bed. Talk to her. She knows your voice. That matters. I'm not much of a talker, he said. Then say anything. The words don't matter as much as the voice. She handed him a cloth. Change this every 4 minutes. I'll get more water. He sat. He took the cloth and laid it with careful hands across Emma's forehead, and then he looked at his daughter's face and said, in a low, rough voice, Hey, little one. Hey, I'm right here. Claire went to the kitchen. She put more water on to heat and stood at the stove for a moment with her hands on the edge of the warming surface, letting herself have 30 seconds of the feelings she'd been keeping out of the room. The fear was real. She was not so practiced at pragmatism that she'd stopped being afraid, just at getting afraid at a more convenient time. Emma's fever was high, without a doctor, without proper medicine. With a storm pinning them in and the night still going, the situation had sharp edges on it that she could feel clearly now that she was alone in the kitchen. She took the 30 seconds. Then she picked up the water and went back shaum. The night was long in the specific way that frightening nights are long. Not slowly, exactly, but with a different texture to each hour having its own character that the next hour might or might not improve on. Clara tracked Emma's fever by the heat of her skin and the quality of her breathing and the brightness of her eyes, which were too bright for the first few hours, and then, around 2 a.m, seemed to her to be changing. She wasn't sure. She was so tired by then that she didn't entirely trust her own assessment. Does she feel cooler to you? She asked Wade, who had been in the chair beside the bed since midnight, only leaving when Clara made him drink coffee and eat something at 1 a.m, an instruction he'd resisted and then complied with in the way he complied with most of her practical instructions. Without enthusiasm, without argument, he put his hand on Emma's forehead. He kept it there for a moment. Maybe, he said. A little. Tell me if you're saying that because it's true or because you want it to be true, Clara said. He looked at her over Emma's head. Little of both, he said. But I think it's true. Clara changed the cloth. Emma's eyes opened. They'd been closed for an hour, a sleep that was hard to interpret, and tracked to Clara's face. Hey, Clara said. Emma blinked. Her hand moved on the sheet. You're all right, Clara said. We're right here. Emma's mouth moved. Not a cough, not a sound. Her lips moved around a shape that might have been a word and didn't find the air to carry it. She frowned, like the mechanism had surprised her. Don't try, Clara said. Rest. Emma's hand moved again. The small gesture she used sometimes. The air writing that Clara had been gradually learning. But it was too weak to read clearly, and Clara just put her hand over it and held it, and Emma's eyes went closed again. Wade let out a breath that was not quite steady. She's coming down, Clara said. She was not completely certain of this, but she was certain enough, and certain enough was what was available. You don't know that, he said. No, she said, but I think so. He looked at Emma's face. I can't lose her, he said. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a fact stated at the bottom of everything, the foundation he was standing on, and Clara heard it that way. You're not going to, she said. You can't promise that either. No, she said again. I can't. She wrung the cloth and laid it back. But she's fighting. You can see that. That child is fighting. He was quiet. He put his large, weathered hand over Emma's and sat there with the patience of a man who had decided that patience was the only weapon he had access to and he was going to use it to its limit. Clara changed the cloth again, checked the solution, made Wade drink more coffee, sat on the edge of the bed and talked, quietly, about nothing. The dried apple compote, the mending basket, the lemon drops from the general store, pepper on the windowsill. Small, ordinary things that had happened in this house in the last 2 weeks. The inventory of ordinary life spoken quietly into the dark, because ordinary life was the destination and naming it helped point the way. The fever broke at 4:30 in the morning. Clara knew it by the sweat, the sudden cold film on Emma's skin that meant the body had finally won the argument it had been having with itself since yesterday evening. Emma's breathing changed, the tight, fast quality of it unwound into something longer, slower, a depth to it that had been absent for hours. Clara sat back in her chair and let herself breathe. Wade had his face in his hands. She let him have that too. It wasn't a moment that needed commentary. After a while, he lifted his head and looked at his daughter, who was sleeping with the pure, heavy sleep of a body that had used up everything it had and needed to recoup. The color in her face was different. Still pale, but not the fever pale, not that particular ashen quality that had been there at 2 a.m. She needs sleep now, Clara said, real sleep, and water when she wakes, and broth if we have anything to make it with. There's a ham bone, Wade said. His voice was rough. In the cold larder. That'll do. Clara stood up. Her back ached from the chair and her eyes felt full of sand. You should sleep too. I'm staying. I know you are, she said. I meant in the chair. Just sleep in the chair. He looked at her. She'd stopped looking the way she usually looked. Controlled, composed, the practical efficiency she brought to most situations. She just looked tired and like someone who had been afraid and was managing the aftermath of that, which was its own kind of work. You should sleep too, he said. I will. In a little while. She picked up the basin. Let me make up the broth and then I'll sit with her a while if you want to lie down proper. I'm not leaving, he said again. Fine, she said. Both of us in chairs then. We'll sleep like a couple of fence posts. It wasn't funny, not really. He almost smiled anyway. Almost was enough at 4:30 in the morning after a night like that. Dawn came gray and slow, the storm reduced to a low mutter of wind rather than its earlier insistence. Clara woke in the chair with a crick in her neck and the particular disorientation of someone who fell asleep somewhere unexpected, and her first action was to look at Emma, who was still sleeping. Wade was asleep in the other chair, chin dropped to his chest, one hand still on the edge of Emma's bed in the way he'd kept it all night. maintaining contact. He looked, in sleep, like a man who'd been working outdoors for 15 years, which was what he was. Lines around the eyes, the weathering of wind and sun and cold, and underneath all of that, something that was simply tired in the way that parents of sick children were tired in the cells. Clara got up carefully and went to the kitchen and started the broth with the ham bone and water and the last of the dried herbs on the shelf. She stood at the stove and waited for it to come up to heat and watched the gray light grow incrementally in the east window, and she thought about the night, about the sound of Emma's labored breathing, and the moment at 2 a.m. when the fever had seemed to spike, and Clara had changed the cloth with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. She thought about what Wade had said. I can't lose her. The bottom of everything. The foundation he was standing on. She thought about what it meant to care that much for someone's survival. To sit in a chair all night holding a thread of contact between your hand and their bed frame, refusing to let go. She had done the same thing. She recognized it in him because she'd been doing the same thing. That was worth something, she thought, to recognize it. To know that two people had sat in chairs on opposite sides of a child's bed and held on. Emma woke at 8. She woke slowly, the way people woke after a fever broke, surfacing through layers, confused at first about where she was, and then recognizing the ceiling, the quilt, the familiar things. Her eyes found Clara first, who was sitting beside the bed with a cup of broth, and then found her father, who had woken when Clara woke and was standing in the doorway with the expression of a man who would stand in that doorway for as long as it took. Hey, Clara said. Good morning. Emma looked at her. Her expression was soft in a way it usually wasn't, the guardedness temporarily gone, the careful watchfulness that was her ordinary manner stripped away by exhaustion, and what was left underneath was simply Emma, without the layers. Are you thirsty? Clara said. Emma moved her chin. Yes. Good. Drink this slowly. Your stomach's going to be unhappy for a day or two, so we're going to be careful. She helped Emma sit up enough to drink, which Emma managed with effort and without protest, which told Clara she was feeling weak but not confused. The broth disappeared slowly. Wade came from the doorway and sat on the side of the bed, and Emma leaned against his shoulder without ceremony, the way she had at supper before all of this. And he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that while Emma's eyes went around the room. They landed on the windowsill where Pepper sat. Clara got up and brought Pepper and set her on the bed beside Emma, who took her with the hand that wasn't caught between herself and her father and tucked her against her chest. She kept watch, Clara said. Very responsible horse. Emma looked at Pepper. Then she looked at Clara. And then for the first time, not in air writing, not on paper, Emma's mouth moved, and what came out was small and rough from disuse and from the night, barely more than a breath with a shape to it, but it was unmistakable. Thank you, Emma said. The room was very quiet. Wade's arm tightened around his daughter, a single motion that he stilled immediately because he didn't want to startle anything that was happening. Clara looked at Emma's face. The girl was looking back at her with those steady eyes, and the expression in them was the one that had been building since the first night, since the doorway and the careful knock and the question that hadn't had words yet. It had words now. Simple ones, but hers. You're welcome, Sus, Clara said, with a steadiness she was working for and mostly achieving. You scared us pretty thoroughly. Emma's mouth did the thing that was almost a smile. It got a little closer this time. Get some more sleep, Clara said. I'll make something better for lunch if your stomach's up to it. She got up and went to the kitchen because the room needed a moment, and she was the right person to leave it. She stood at the counter and looked out the window at the snow, which was still there, immovable and white and completely indifferent, and she put both hands flat on the counter surface and just breathed for a while. After a few minutes, she heard Wade step in the hallway, and he came into the kitchen and stopped. She didn't turn around. She's asleep again, he said. Good. He moved to the other side of the counter and leaned against it, facing her, and she turned to look at him because he was waiting for her to. She spoke, he said. Yes. She hasn't... He stopped. 14 months. I know, Clara said. You... He stopped again. He was not good at this. At the territory past the functional. She could see him working at it. Last night, I don't know what would have happened if Don't finish that, Clara said. It didn't happen. She's all right. Because of what you did. Because of what both of us did, she said. You were there all night. I would have been useless without someone telling me what to do, he said. And there was something in his voice that was not self-pity, but was honest enough to be uncomfortable. The admission of a man who'd been running on the edge of his own capacity for a long time and knew it. Clara looked at him across the counter. She thought about what to say and settled on, You weren't useless. You were her father. That's not nothing. That's not even close to nothing. He held that for a moment. Then, I know you're planning to leave when the road clears. Yes, she said. I know you have a situation waiting in Dalton Creek. Yes. He was quiet. He looked at the counter between them. I'm not asking you to change your plans, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm just... He stopped a third time. Saying it out loud, Clara said. Yeah, he said, saying it out loud. She nodded. She understood what that cost for a man like this in a kitchen like this at 5 a.m. after a night like that. The saying of it was its own kind of thing, separate from what came next. Let me get Emma through the next few days, Clara said, and then we'll see where things stand. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a refusal. It was the truth of where she was, which was the only thing she had to offer. He nodded, once. All right, he said. He went back to Emma's room. Clara put the kettle on and stood at the window and watched the sky lighten in the east, going from gray to the pale yellow-white of a winter morning that had decided, perhaps, to be slightly less brutal than the one before it. The road would be clear in a day, maybe 2. She looked at the pale sky and the white fields and the dark line of the mountains beyond, and she thought that she had been in Black Hollow for 11 days, and in those 11 days she had reorganized a kitchen and mended a basket of clothes and learned an alphabet of air writing and sat up all night with a feverish child, and that the spare room at the end of the hall had Pepper in the window and the indent of her head in the pillow, and that somewhere in all of this she had done the thing she hadn't intended to do and couldn't now undo. She'd stopped being a stranger here. The kettle began to whistle, low and then insistent, and she took it off the heat and made the coffee and set Wade's cup by the stove where it would stay warm until he came back for it. And she did this without thinking, because she already knew where he'd want it, and that was the kind of knowing that didn't happen in 11 days unless something real had taken place. Outside, the wind had stopped entirely for the first time in days. The silence it left behind was not empty. It was full of things that hadn't been said yet, and were still deciding whether they would be. Clara drank her coffee and waited for the day to begin. Emma recovered the way children recovered from fevers, faster than any adult had a right to expect, and with a thoroughness that made the previous night seem almost dreamlike by the third day after. By Thursday, she was sitting up and eating properly. By Friday, she was back at the kitchen table with her paper and pencil, and by Saturday morning, she was outside walking the fence perimeter again, Pepper in her coat pocket, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her mouth moving with the private words that belonged to her alone. Clara watched her from the kitchen window and felt the specific relief of a crisis that had passed, and underneath it the specific complication that the crisis passing meant the ordinary circumstances had resumed, including the road, which Wade confirmed on Saturday morning was passable again. "Wagon'll get through," he said, at the kitchen table, wrapping his hands around his coffee. "Slowly, but it'll get through." Clara nodded. She was looking at the table. "Mrs. Fowler's letter said another week," Wade said. "You've still got time." "I know." He was quiet. She was quiet. Outside, Emma was finishing her perimeter walk with the deliberateness of a small person who took her self-assigned responsibilities seriously. "I want to go into town," Clara said finally, "before I make any decisions about the road. I need to find out about that letter from the attorneys. Someone in Black Hollow sent my name to St. Louis, and I'd like to understand who and why." "All right," Wade said. "I'll take you. You don't have to come." "I know I don't," he said, with the particular flatness he used when the discussion was over. They went on Saturday afternoon, Emma between them on the wagon seat as had become their habit, the three of them in a configuration that Clara was aware looked, from the outside, like something it wasn't, or possibly was, which was the more complicated problem. Black Hollow on a Saturday in January was livelier than it had been on her earlier visit. The general store had several horses tied outside, and there were people on the sidewalks in the particular way of a day when the weather had permitted an exodus from outlying homesteads. Clara recognized the atmosphere. It was the atmosphere of a small place where news traveled faster than the people carrying it, and where the arrival of persons of interest was noted and communicated before those persons had finished hitching their horses. She'd known they'd be noticed. She hadn't known quite how thoroughly or how immediately. They were inside the general store for less than 10 minutes before the door opened and a man she'd never seen before walked in with the bearing of someone who'd been waiting for a specific moment and had decided this was it. He was in his 50s, well-dressed for a frontier town, with the kind of face that organized itself around grievance without much effort. Beside him was a woman of similar age, a small, tight-lipped woman in a gray coat who looked at Clara with an expression that was almost eager. Clara went still. Behind the counter, Mrs. Yancey had stopped pretending to restock the shelf she was restocking. The two other customers in the store had similarly found reasons to remain where they were. "That's her," the woman in the gray coat said. Not to Clara, to the room. The man looked at Clara with the satisfaction of someone who'd found what they came for. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I am George Aldwell, and this is my wife Patricia. I believe our attorneys wrote to you." Clara set down the tin of coffee she'd been holding and looked at him. "They did," she said. "I don't know you, Mr. Aldwell. I've never worked for you. I've never been to Garrison Street." "That's a bold claim," Aldwell said, "given that 3 of my neighbors saw you leaving my house on the night of December 15th with a bag over your shoulder." "I left St. Louis on December 24th, Clara said, "on the Missouri Pacific. That's verifiable." "December 15th is not December 24th, Miss Bennett. Do you deny being in St. Louis before the 24th? Clara paused. She had been in St. Louis. Of course she'd been in St. Louis. She'd been living and working there for 4 years. "I was in St. Louis," she said. "I worked at the Fulton Street Laundry. Not for you. I don't know your address. I don't know your wife. I've never taken anything from anyone." "You match the description exactly," Patricia Aldwell said, in a voice that was pleased to be saying it. "Brown hair, medium height, traveling alone. Our housekeeper saw her face." "There are 10,000 women in St. Louis who match that description," Clara said. The store had gone completely silent. Clara was aware, with the part of her brain that ran parallel to crisis and never quite stopped functioning, that this was precisely what small towns did to women without money or connections. They provided an audience for things like this, an audience that would be the jury afterward, that would carry the verdict home to their dinner tables and pass it around like a dish that kept being served. $42, Aldwell said, to the room as much as to her. He had the practiced volume of a man who'd done this kind of thing before, in front of people, on purpose. And a silver candlestick and a small portrait. Family heirloom. These things were taken from our home, and we have followed this woman at considerable expense and inconvenience. "I don't have your money," Clara said. "I have $4.30. You're welcome to look in my bag." "That's exactly what a thief would say," Patricia Aldwell said, after she'd hidden it somewhere. "Where would I have hidden $42 in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard?" "At Mercer's Ranch," Mrs. Yancey said from behind the counter, and then seemed to realize she'd said it out loud and looked at the shelf she wasn't restocking. The word hung in the air. Clara heard it the way you heard something you'd been half expecting, like a door that had been loose on its hinges finally coming off. Aldwell looked at Wade. "You're Mercer?" he said. Wade had been standing near the door, which was where Clara had been hoping he'd stay. Back, uninvolved, the situation was hers to handle. But now he stepped forward, not far, but enough, and said, "Yes." "And this woman has been living on your property for how long?" "Miss Bennett is a guest at my ranch," Wade said. "She was stranded by the storm, that's all." "A guest?" Patricia Aldwell repeated, with a particular emphasis that put a meaning on the word that had nothing to do with its dictionary definition. Clara felt the shape of what was happening and understood that it had been building since before this moment, that whoever had written to Alderman and Kress in Denver had known exactly what they were sending for, had planted the seed and stepped back and waited for it to grow. Someone in this town had decided Clara Bennett was a problem and had found a way to make her into one. "I'd like to know," Clara said, with a steadiness that cost her more than she showed, "who gave these people my name and whereabouts? That's the question that interests me most right now." Aldwell's expression shifted. He'd expected more from her, more denial, more deflection, something he could dig into and use. Claire's directness in asking about the source seemed to momentarily dislocate his approach. "That's not relevant," he said. "I think it's highly relevant," Clara said. "You've come a very long way to accuse a woman you've never met of a crime because someone here told you she matched a description, that someone had reason to want me in difficulty, and I'd like to know who it was." A sound from the back of the store. Clara turned. Tom Adler from the livery was standing near the stove, where he'd apparently been since before they came in, leaning against the wall with the particular expression of a man who'd miscalculated the distance between himself and the center of a situation. Clara looked at him. He looked at the floor. "Tom," Wade said. "I didn't know they'd come all the way up here," Adler said to the floor. "I just sent a letter. Seemed like, a woman alone with no references, nobody knowing her. You didn't know her either," Wade said. "I knew she wasn't right," Adler said, and in the words was the residue of that first night in the livery doorway, the slow grin and the offer, and the look on his face when she'd walked away from it. Something off about her from the start. Clara looked at him for a moment, at the livery man who'd decided she was a problem because she'd declined his hospitality and walked away without looking back. She'd thought, in the aftermath of that night, that he was simply unpleasant. She hadn't accounted for the fact that unpleasant men sometimes also held grudges. "Well," she said quietly. "Now I know." Aldwell had recovered his footing. "This doesn't change the facts of our situation," he said, louder now, finding the room again. "The woman in our house was not me," Clara said. "Our housekeeper saw someone else." Clara turned back to him fully. "Mr. Aldwell, I understand you've lost money, and I'm sorry for it. Genuinely. Being robbed is a serious thing, and I hope you find the person responsible. It isn't me. I was at the Fulton Street Laundry on December 15th. I can name 3 people who were working alongside me that day. I can name the floor manager. I can name the hour my shift ended." She paused. "What I cannot do is disprove something that didn't happen to your satisfaction in the middle of a general store with no evidence, in front of people who've already decided their opinion." "Your word against our housekeepers," Patricia Aldwell said. "Yes," Claire said. "My word, which is all I have." She looked at the room, at Mrs. Yancey with her shelf, at the 2 other customers who were looking at her now with the expressions of people who'd come in for flour and gotten theater instead, at Tom Adler studying the floor, at Wade near the door. She picked up her bag. She paid for the tin of coffee she'd been holding, counting coins from her purse onto the counter with deliberate steadiness, and Mrs. Yancey took them without meeting her eyes. "Good afternoon," Clara said to the room, and walked out. She made it to the wagon and stood beside it with her hand on the sideboard and breathed. The cold hit her face, and she let it. Behind her she could hear voices in the store, Aldwell's elevated, and then Wade's, lower, and she didn't hear the words and didn't try to. Emma was in the wagon, where they'd left her. She was looking at Clara with those steady eyes, and she had pepper in her hands and was turning her over and over in a slow, nervous rotation. "It's all right," Clara said to Emma. Emma looked at her, then she wrote in the air. Clara read it this time, clearly. "Is it?" Clara thought about the honest answer. "It's complicated," she said, "but manageable." Emma looked unconvinced. She turned Pepper over twice more. The store door opened and Wade came out. His expression was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the careful blankness of ordinary days, but something tighter, with an edge. "He's going to the sheriff," Wade said, filing a report. "Can the sheriff act on it?" "He'll have to take it seriously. A formal complaint from outside, from a firm with attorneys." He stopped. "It doesn't matter that it's nonsense. It's on paper." Clara looked at the street. "I need to write to the Fulton Street Laundry," she said. "The floor manager, a man named Briggs. He'll confirm my dates. And 2 women who worked my shift." She paused. "How long does mail take to Denver?" "Week, maybe more this time of year. And the sheriff will hold the matter most likely, until he hears back. But if Aldwell pushes, he might—" Wade's jaw tightened. "I don't know what he might do. Briggs is a good sheriff, but he's also a man who can't ignore a formal complaint." Clara stood at the wagon side and considered this. Emma was watching her. The cold was settling in, the late afternoon light going orange at the horizon. The street had a few people in it who were taking the longer route past the wagon with a degree of interest that was not accidental. She knew, in the way she'd known many things in the last 2 weeks, through proximity and observation, and the kind of intelligence that came from paying close attention, that the story the town had been building about her had just found its confirmation. The Aldwells had given it a name and a dollar amount and an attorney's letterhead, and that was enough. She'd seen it on Mrs. Yancey's face when the coins went on the counter. She'd heard it in the room's silence. She also knew, with the same intelligence, that staying was no longer the question it had been that morning. She'd been telling herself, in the 2 days since Emma's fever broke, that she would figure something out, that the situation at the ranch was delicate and the child was still recovering and the road was just now clearing, and that these were reasons to stay a little longer, for practical purposes. She'd been telling herself this, and it had been true enough to hold, mostly, while also being something she was using as a reason to avoid deciding. The Aldwells had decided it for her. She couldn't stay. Not like this. Not with a formal complaint sitting at the sheriff's office and the whole of Black Hollow watching from behind store windows to see what kind of woman she really was. The story that would follow Wade and Emma if she stayed. The strange woman who'd moved into the widower's house and then been accused of theft and stayed anyway. She could see exactly where that story went and what it cost. Not her. She already had nothing to protect. But Wade had the ranch and his standing in this community and the quiet life he'd built from the wreckage of his grief. And Emma had a voice she'd just gotten back in a world that was just beginning to open again. And Clara Bennett was not willing to be the reason those things were damaged. It was the clearest thing she'd thought all day, and also the most painful. She cooked supper that evening with the particular efficiency of someone managing their own feelings through physical work, and she did it in a way that she hoped didn't show, though she was fairly certain Emma could tell. The child watched her from the table with that attentive stillness, and twice she held out her paper and pencil as if she was going to write something and then put it down without writing anything, which meant she had read something in Clara's movements that she didn't know how to address. Wade ate supper and didn't talk much, which was ordinary, and didn't mention the Aldwells or Tom Adler or the sheriff, which was its own kind of talking. After Emma was in bed and the dishes were done, Clara went to the spare room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room. Pepper on the windowsill, her dress on the peg, her novel on the ledge. The things that had made the room hers, temporarily, in the way of a person passing through. She got her carpet bag from under the bed and started packing it. She did it the same way she'd unpacked it, methodically, without drama. The dresses off the peg, the underthings from the drawer, the novel. She left the washstand as she'd found it. She looked at Pepper on the windowsill for a long time and then left her where she was because Emma would want her in the morning, and the morning was going to be difficult enough. She wrote 2 letters at the washstand by lamplight, using the notepaper she'd had since St. Louis. The first was to Mrs. Fowler in Dalton Creek, explaining that she would be arriving on the first available transport from Black Hollow and apologizing for the extended delay. The second was to Mr. Briggs at the Fulton Street Laundry, asking him to write to the sheriff of Black Hollow, confirming her employment dates and the specifics of her shift schedule through December of 1885. She wrote it carefully, formally, with the kind of precision that would be useful in a legal context, and she folded it and addressed it and set both letters beside her bag. She sat for a while after. The house was quiet. She could hear the particular silence of a house where people were asleep, different from empty quiet. She thought about the kitchen she'd reorganized, and the mending basket, and the fixed floorboard, and the loose shutter latch. She thought about Emma's hand finding her wrist in the dark of the fever night, and "thank you" said in a voice rough from disuse. She thought about Wade at the kitchen table. I'm just saying it out loud, and what it cost him, and why he'd done it. She thought that she was 23 years old, and she had made a habit of leaving places before they could send her away, because leaving on your own terms was the only dignity available when you didn't have the other kinds of dignity that came from money or family or standing. She'd been doing it since she was 19. It was a skill she'd gotten competent at, in the way she'd gotten competent at fixing things, through repetition and the absence of alternatives. She lay down on top of the quilt because it seemed absurd to get under it when she was leaving before light, and she lay there in her clothes and her coat and watched the lamp burn low. She was up at 4. The house was dark and cold, and the floorboards were the kind of cold that came through boot soles. She picked up her bag and her letters and went down the hallway on careful feet, the way she'd gone down hallways in rooming houses all her working life, quietly, leaving nothing behind except the shape she'd made in the space. In the kitchen, she set her bag by the door and started the fire, because she couldn't leave without the fire started. It was not rational, but it was true. She built it up good, enough to hold until the household woke, and she stood and watched it catch. Then she heard the sound of a door and steps, and Wade appeared in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes. He looked at her. He looked at the bag by the door. He stood there for a moment. "You're going," he said. "Yes." He came into the kitchen and poured himself a coffee from the pot she'd already started. He'd wake up, and there'd be coffee, the same as every morning, the last thing she could give him. And he stood at the counter and held it and didn't say anything for a while. "It's because of the Aldwells," he said. "Because of what it looks like if you stay." "Partly," she said. "Yes." "And partly not," he said, which was perceptive in the way she'd come to expect from him, the intelligence that didn't announce itself. "The road is clear," she said. "Mrs. Fowler has held the position longer than she should have. I have work waiting, and I have a legal situation that's easier to manage from a distance than it is from your kitchen." All of this was true. None of it was the whole of it, and she thought he knew that and was choosing to let her have it. "I don't want you to go," he said. He said it the same way he said most things, directly, without preamble, without trying to dress it up. "Wade, I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay. I'm just being accurate." She looked at the fire. "I know," she said. "Emma's going to—" He stopped. "She's going to take it hard." "I know that too." Clara breathed in carefully. "Tell her I said she has everything she needs. She does. She found her voice. She knows how to manage the kitchen. Clara stopped. "Tell her Pepper stays in the window because she likes the view." He was looking at her with that steady, careful expression. "That's not enough," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." The fire was going well now. The kitchen was warming. Outside, the sky was still fully dark, and the first train west was at 6:15, which the Yancey boy had told her days ago in the course of a conversation about other things entirely, the way useful information sometimes arrived. She picked up her bag. "The letters," she said, gesturing to the two folded pieces of paper on the table. "The one for Mrs. Fowler. Can you have someone take it to the station to go with the next mail? And the one for Mr. Briggs at the Fulton Street Laundry. It needs to go to the sheriff as well, or a copy does. It'll clear my name. It's all there." "I'll take care of it," he said. She nodded. She stood at the door with her bag and her coat and looked at him across the kitchen. The lamp, the fire, the reorganized pots, the mended things, the ordinary geography of a house she'd been living in for nearly 2 weeks, and which had, without her permission, and somewhat against her better judgment, become the closest thing to home she'd felt in years. "Wade," she said. He looked at her. She couldn't think of what she'd been going to say. It had seemed like something, and then it wasn't, and what was left was just his name in the kitchen and the fire and the dark outside the window. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping the wagon." "You were sitting on some steps in a blizzard," he said. "That wasn't complicated." "It was for me," she said. She went out before he could answer because if he answered, she was going to have difficulty with the next 15 minutes, and the next 15 minutes required her to walk down the road to the station in the dark and not look back at the lighted windows. She didn't look back. She walked the road to Black Hollow in the pre-dawn dark, the snow compacted underfoot, her breath making the small temporary clouds that disappeared immediately into the cold air. The station was dim when she arrived, the agent's light just coming on behind the frosted window. She waited on the platform in the cold with her bag at her feet and looked at the mountains to the west, black shapes against a sky that was beginning, at its very lowest edge, to think about being a different color. She was cold. She was tired. She had $4.30, the same as she'd had when she got off the wrong train on Christmas Eve, minus the cost of a packet of needles and a paper of lemon drops. She stood on the platform and looked at the mountains and thought that she had done the right thing, and that doing the right thing and feeling right about it were not the same activity and didn't necessarily happen at the same time. The sky at the horizon went from black to the particular shade of dark blue that happened in the 20 minutes before dawn. The mountains held their shape against it. Somewhere down the track, still invisible, still distant, the 6:15 was making its way west. Clara stood on the platform and waited for it, and she did not cry, and she did not look back toward the ranch road, and she did not think about Pepper on the windowsill or the child who would wake up and find her gone. And she managed all of this with the particular practiced discipline of a woman who had learned to leave and was leaving now because it was the right thing, because there was no other way, because the people she'd come to care about in that house deserved better than the trouble she was bringing, and because sometimes caring about people meant removing yourself from the equation before you made things worse. She believed all of this. She stood on the platform and believed it with everything she had, while the sky continued its slow, indifferent progression toward light. The 6:15 was late. Clara had been standing on the platform for 40 minutes by the time the sky had committed fully to daylight, the mountains going from black shapes to gray to the particular blue-white of winter morning, and the train was not there. She'd checked the schedule board twice. 6:15 westbound, Black Hollow Station, connecting through Laramie to Dalton Creek. It was now past 7. The station agent, a thin man she hadn't spoken to since the first night, had opened his window and told her there was a delay somewhere down the line. Could be an hour, could be more. The weather had been difficult on the tracks, so she stood and waited. This was, she reflected, a very on-theme development for a trip that had begun with the wrong stop and proceeded through a blizzard, a fever, and a public accusation of theft. The universe apparently had opinions about her schedule. She shifted her bag from one hand to the other and breathed the cold air and looked at the street. Black Hollow at 7 in the morning on a Sunday was not busy, but it was not empty either. A few horses tied outside the Copper Nail, which had apparently already seen business. A woman crossing the far end of the street with a basket. Smoke from most chimneys, the town warming itself against another cold day. Nobody looked at her. Nobody came to the platform. She had believed, leaving the ranch before dawn, that the hardest part was the leaving. She was revising that assessment. The hardest part was the standing still afterward, with nowhere useful to put her hands, waiting for a train that was making its own decisions about timing. She thought about Emma waking up and finding her gone. She had thought about this on the walk into town, and then firmly put it aside. And it had come back, the way things came back when you were standing on a train platform with nothing to do. The child would wake up and go to the kitchen expecting the fire already going and the morning moving with the particular rhythm it had acquired over 2 weeks. And instead there would be Wade, who loved his daughter completely and was not always sure what to do with her, and an empty spare room with Pepper on the windowsill. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them because the mountains were still there and the cold was real, and neither of them cared about her feelings, which was useful. The sound of a wagon on the street behind her. She didn't turn. She'd been determinedly not turning toward the road from the ranch since she'd arrived, which was a choice that required active maintenance. The wagon stopped. She turned. It was not Wade's wagon. It was a smaller rig, a single horse, driven by a woman Clara recognized after a moment as Mrs. Teague, the round woman who'd been sitting with Emma the first night, the one who'd looked Clara over with the directness of a person forming a permanent opinion. She was climbing down from the seat with the deliberate efficiency of a woman who didn't waste motion, and she was looking at Clara with an expression that was hard to read from this distance. Clara watched her cross the platform. "I heard you were leaving," Mrs. Teague said, by way of greeting. "News travels," Clara said. "In this town, it travels before the thing happens." Mrs. Teague set her hands on her hips and looked at Clara with that same assessing directness. "I've been sitting on something since yesterday, and I've decided I can't sit on it anymore, because I'm not made for sitting on things, and it's uncomfortable." Clara waited. "I was in the Yancey store on Thursday," Mrs. Teague said, 2 days before the Aldwells came in. "I was there when Patricia Aldwell came in alone. Her husband was at the sheriff's office, and I heard her talking to Ruth Yancey about you." She paused. "I heard her describe the woman they were looking for." "Medium height, brown hair," Clara said. "She described a scar," Mrs. Teague said. "Small one, on the left hand, between the thumb and the forefinger. She said their housekeeper had noticed it particularly." Clara looked at her own hands. Her left hand, the space between thumb and forefinger, which was smooth and unmarked, the same as it had always been. "Do you have such a scar?" Mrs. Teague asked. No, Clara said. I know you don't, Mrs. Teague said. I noticed your hands the first night at the ranch, when you were working in the kitchen. Noticing hands is a habit of mine. I have known you didn't match their description since Thursday afternoon. She stopped. I should have said something then. I didn't, because well, I had opinions about you that were getting in the way of doing right, and I'm not proud of that. Clara looked at her steadily. I'm saying something now, Mrs. Teague said. I'll say it to the sheriff. I'll say it to whoever needs to hear it. You don't have their scar. You're not their woman, and I'll put my name to that. The platform was quiet. The station agent's window was a few feet away, and Clara was fairly certain he was hearing all of this, which was either a problem or not, depending on what kind of man he was. Why didn't you say anything on Thursday? Clara said. Not accusatory. She genuinely wanted to understand. Mrs. Teague had the grace to look uncomfortable. Because Tom Adler had been talking, she said, and Ruth Yancey had been talking, and I had thoughts about what a woman was doing at a widower's ranch without proper arrangement, and I let those thoughts crowd out what I actually knew. She paused. I was wrong. I'm correcting it. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about what it cost a woman in a small town to stand on a train platform and say she'd been wrong. Not nothing at all. Thank you, Clara said. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Teague said. Come to the sheriff's office first. Sheriff Briggs was a deliberate man. Clara had heard this from Wade, but was now experiencing it directly. He was the kind of person who listened to everything before he said anything, who asked questions that were precise rather than numerous, and who had the specific quality of fairness that came not from naivety, but from having seen enough human messiness to know that the obvious explanation was not always the accurate one. He listened to Mrs. Teague. He looked at Clara's left hand. He asked Clara 3 specific questions about her whereabouts on December 15th and wrote down her answers without editorial comment. Then he asked when she'd expect correspondence from Mr. Briggs at the Fulton Street Laundry. 10 days, perhaps, Clara said. Possibly less. The Aldwells are staying at the boarding house, Briggs said. Greta Holst's place. I'll speak to them this morning. The formal complaint is still on file, but a material inconsistency in the description changes the character of the matter. He paused. You understand it's not resolved until we hear from St. Louis. I understand, Clara said. Where will you be? She paused. She'd had her bag packed and a train to catch, a train that was still an hour away at minimum, probably more. She thought about the answer to his question. I'm not entirely certain, she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said all morning. Briggs nodded. Don't leave the territory until this is cleared, he said. That's not a request. I won't, she said. She came out of the sheriff's office into the cold morning and stood on the sidewalk with her bag and Mrs. Teague beside her, and the two of them stood there for a moment without speaking. The train's delayed anyway, Mrs. Teague said. Yes, Clara said. And you can't leave the territory. No. Mrs. Teague looked at her with that direct gaze. Then you have a decision to make, she said, and I think you already know what it is, which is why you look the way you look. How do I look? Clara said. Like someone standing at a door they've already decided to walk through, trying to convince themselves they haven't decided yet. Clara looked at the street, at the buildings of Black Hollow in the winter morning light, the ordinary frontier architecture of a place that was just a place. Not charming, not hostile, just real. She looked at the copper nail and the general store and the livery where Tom Adler's mean-spirited letter had started all of this, and she thought that a place was what happened in it, not what it looked like. And what had happened here was more complicated than the building front suggested. I reorganized that man's kitchen, Clara said, which was not a complete sentence as an explanation, but Mrs. Teague seemed to receive it as one. I know, Mrs. Teague said. He told me. Wade Mercer talking about a kitchen reorganization is about as likely as that mountain moving. She pointed at the nearest peak. I knew something had happened. Clara almost smiled. Emma spoke, she said, 2 nights ago, after the fever. Mrs. Teague was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, lower, and carrying something. Ruth Yancey's going to feel that one for a while, she said, when she hears it. She's known that child since she was born. She doesn't need to feel anything, Clara said. She just needs to know Emma is all right. Mrs. Teague looked at her. "You're a more generous woman than I've been to you," she said. "I want you to know I'm aware of that." Well, she was still standing on the platform at 9:40 when the train finally appeared at the eastern curve of the track, making its belated way toward the station with the unhurried momentum of machinery that had decided its own schedule. She watched it come and felt the particular complicated feeling of someone watching an exit approach that they're no longer certain they want to use. The sheriff's restriction was practical. She couldn't leave the territory. That was the factual circumstance. But Clara Bennett had been navigating the space between factual circumstances and actual decisions for her entire adult life. And she knew the difference between a constraint that determined your course and a constraint that merely gave you permission to choose the course you already wanted. She was still working out which this was when she heard footsteps on the platform boards behind her, and she turned, and it was not Mrs. Teague. It was Wade. He was alone, which surprised her. She'd expected Emma. He had come on horseback, she guessed, from the state of his coat, which still had cold radiating off it in a way that suggested he'd ridden hard and recently. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her, and his face had the same set qualities she'd seen yesterday in the store. Not the tight anger of the Aldwell confrontation, but something underneath it, more fundamental. "The sheriff told you," she said. "I went to the sheriff first," he said, "before I came here. He told me about Mrs. Teague." "Then you know the situation isn't resolved yet," she said. 10 days, maybe more." "I know. And you know the sheriff asked me not to leave the territory." "I know that too." The train was pulling in. The sound of it filled the platform. The grind and hiss of something large slowing down, the steam, the noise that made conversation briefly difficult and then possible again as it stopped. "I wasn't going to say anything more than I already said," Wade said. "This morning in the kitchen, I meant what I said. I wasn't asking you to stay." "I know," Clara said. "But Emma was awake," he said. "When I got back from the station this morning, she'd been awake since before I left, I think. She knew." He paused. "She didn't cry. Emma doesn't cry. She went and got Pepper from the windowsill, and she sat at the kitchen table and she wrote one thing on her paper." Clara waited. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a folded piece of notepaper and held it out to her. She took it and opened it. Emma's handwriting, careful and deliberate. "Tell her the kitchen isn't right without her." Clara stood with the paper in her hand and the train behind her and the cold around both of them, and she felt the particular internal shift of something that had been held in place by determination letting go. She'd spent 2 weeks telling herself the right things, that she was a guest, that this was temporary, that she had a job waiting and a plan and the good sense not to build a life on someone else's foundation without being invited. She'd been right about most of it. The guest part had been true at the beginning. The temporary part had been true at the beginning. At some point between the reorganized pots and the mending basket and the fever night and "Thank you," said, in a voice rough from disuse, the beginning had become something else. "She's 8 years old," Clara said. "She'll adjust." "She adjusted when her mother died," Wade said. "She adjusted by stopping talking for 14 months. He said this without anger, just fact. The fact of a man who understood his daughter and what she cost herself to survive loss. "I'm not saying Emma is your responsibility. I'm not saying any of this is." He paused. "I'm saying Emma wrote that. And I drove into town to give it to you, which is its own kind of saying something." Clara looked at the paper. At the careful letters, the steady hand that had learned to make its words in writing because the air wasn't safe enough for speaking, and had only recently discovered that some air was safe after all. The train conductor was calling for boarding. 2 passengers from the platform were moving toward the steps. "The sheriff says 10 days, Clara said. "I know. And I have a situation with the Aldwells that isn't finished." "I'll help with that," he said. "I've already spoken to Briggs about getting a faster correspondence to St. Louis through the territorial office. The sheriff there has a telegraph connection. It could be 3 days." She looked at him. He'd been to the sheriff and arranged telegraph assistance and ridden here on horseback and was standing on the platform in the cold, and he'd done all of this without asking her to be grateful or making any of it a transaction. It was the same as the first night, just doing what needed doing and letting her decide what it meant. "What are you asking?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that careful expression she'd come to know, the one that took its time. "Come back to the ranch," he said, "while this gets sorted. You can't leave anyway, and the spare room's empty, and he stopped. He was not good at asking for things. She knew this about him. And the kitchen isn't right without you. He said it simply, the same words Emma had written. And something about that, the same thought in two different hands from two different people who'd both been careful so long and were both choosing now to say it anyway, made the decision finish itself. I need to send a letter to Mrs. Fowler, Clara said. We can stop at the station office, Wade said, and I want to speak to Tom Adler. He looked at her. Clara, not to cause trouble, she said. I just want him to know I know, that's all. He should know. Wade was quiet for a moment, then nodded. The last call came from the conductor. Clara looked at the train, at the open door, the steps, the interior that would take her west toward Dalton Creek, and Mrs. Fowler's warm letters, and the job that had started all of this. She looked at it for a moment with the full honesty of a person who was choosing and wanted to be clear about what she was choosing. Then she picked up her bag. All right, she said, take me back. They stopped at the Aldwells' boarding house first, which was not what Clara had told Wade she intended, but she'd reconsidered on the walk from the station. The Aldwells were not villains out of a story. They were people who'd been robbed and had followed a bad lead in a desperate direction, and someone in this town had pointed that desperation straight at Clara's life. The Aldwells deserved to hear from her directly. Patricia Aldwell answered the door of Greta Holst's boarding house with the expression of someone who had prepared for confrontation and was surprised to find something different. Clara was not angry. She was calm, which was sometimes more unsettling. I came to tell you that I am not the woman who robbed you, Clara said. I have a witness who heard your housekeeper's description and can confirm I don't match it in a specific physical detail. The sheriff has that information. I'm also writing to my former employer and expect documentation within the week. She paused. I'm sorry about what was taken from your house. I hope you find who did it. I understand you were acting on information you believed was reliable, but I want you to hear from me directly that I'm not responsible. Patricia Aldwell stood in the doorway and looked at Clara with an expression that was going through several phases. The prepared confrontation had nowhere to go. After a moment, she said, What's the detail? The scar, Clara said, and held up her left hand. I don't have one. Patricia Aldwell looked at the hand. Something in her face shifted. A small, uncomfortable reckoning of the kind that happened when a certainty turned out to be less certain than you'd built your actions on. We were told, she started. You were pointed, Clara said, at me, by someone with his own reasons. She lowered her hand. That's not your fault, but it's the truth. She left without waiting for a response. She didn't need one. She'd said what she came to say, and the Aldwells would speak to the sheriff, and the sheriff would speak to his counterpart in St. Louis. And in 3 days or 10 days, the truth would come through on paper, and that would be the end of it. Some things were just logistics, even when they felt like more. Tom Adler at the livery was harder. He was in the yard when she came through the gate, and he saw her coming, and his expression went through a rapid and unflattering sequence before landing on something that was trying to be defiant and achieving mostly uncomfortable. I don't have anything to say to you, he said. You don't need to, Clara said. I'll say what I came to say, and then I'll go. She stopped a few feet from him. You sent my name to St. Louis because I walked away from you on the first night and you were angry about it. You took a grudge and you turned it into something that could have ruined my life, and you did it in the knowledge that a woman alone without connections was the easiest kind of person to do that to. She paused. I want you to know that I know that, and that I know what that says about you, and that the next woman who comes through this town alone and asks for help honestly deserves better than what you gave me. He said nothing. His jaw was set with the specific quality of a man who wanted to argue and couldn't find the argument. That's all, Clara said, and went back through the gate. Wade was waiting at the wagon. He'd watched the whole thing from a distance without intervening, which was the right call, and she appreciated it. Done? He said. Done, she said, and climbed up. The news went through Black Hollow in the particular way that corrections moved through small towns, less dramatically and less comprehensively than the original story, but it moved. Mrs. Teague was efficient about it. Briggs was professional about it. And 2 days after Clara returned to the ranch, a telegraph came through the territorial sheriff's office from St. Louis. A Mr. Briggs of the Fulton Street Laundry confirmed Miss Clara Bennett had been in his employ through December 23rd, had worked a full shift on December 15th and on all preceding dates that month, and was a reliable employee of good character whose absence was noted only because she'd left for a position elsewhere. Briggs showed it to the Aldwells. The Aldwells spoke to their attorneys in Denver. The formal complaint was withdrawn, with no ceremony and no apology, which was how these things went, and Clara had not expected the apology anyway. What she had not expected was what happened on the following Saturday. She was in the kitchen, where she tended to be in the mornings now, with the comfortable authority of someone who knew where everything was and why, when Wade came in from outside and said that there were people at the gate. Several people. She went to the window. Mrs. Teague was there, which was not surprising. Mrs. Yancey was there, which was slightly surprising, and she had her hands folded in front of her with the expression of a woman who had come on purpose and was going to do something with that purpose. There were 3 other women Clara recognized from town, and 2 she didn't, and a man she thought was the barber, and one of the other farmers whose land was adjacent to the Mercer property to the south. "What is this?" Clara said. "I have no idea," Wade said in a tone that suggested he had some idea. She went to the door. Mrs. Teague spoke first, which was appropriate since she was closest to the front and had the temperament for it. "We owe you an apology," she said. "Several of us. The town listened to a bad story when we should have listened better, and some of us made it worse by not speaking up when we knew something worth saying." She looked at Ruth Yancey briefly, and Ruth Yancey looked at the fence post beside her, and then back at Clara. "We heard about Emma," Mrs. Teague continued. "That she's speaking again, and we heard what you did during the fever." "The fever was 3 weeks ago," Clara said. "We're slow sometimes," Mrs. Teague said, "but we get there." Clara looked at the group at the gate. These were not the people who'd come to tell her what they thought of her in the Yancey store. They were the same people, most of them, but they'd come for a different reason, and they were standing in the cold on a Saturday morning to do it, which was its own kind of statement in a place where winter made everything harder. Ruth Yancey spoke. She did it without looking directly at Clara at first, but she got there. "I said things," she said, "or didn't say things I should have. Both count." She paused. "You reorganized that kitchen, and you got that child talking again, and you didn't leave when it was hard, and I was too busy thinking what I thought about the situation to see what was actually happening." She stopped. "I'm sorry. It was an imperfect apology. It didn't cover everything, and it didn't pretend to understand everything, and Ruth Yancey said it with the slightly wooden quality of a woman delivering a prepared speech that she'd worked on and still hadn't gotten fully comfortable with. But it was real. Clara could tell the difference. "I appreciate it," Clara said. "All of you coming." She looked at the group. "I understand how it looked. I know what a woman alone in a stranger's house suggests to people, and I know that's not unreasonable as a concern. It's just, it wasn't what was happening." "We know that now," Mrs. Teague said. "What was happening," Clara said, "was that a family was struggling and I happened to have what it needed. That's all. There's nothing unusual about that. People help each other. It works in both directions." Behind her, she felt rather than heard Wade in the doorway, and she moved slightly to the side so he could stand beside her on the step. "Mercer," said the farmer to the south in a tone of greeting. "Halsey," Wade said. This was apparently sufficient as conversation between them. Men in this country were economical. Mrs. Teague looked at Clara and then at Wade and then back at Clara with the expression of a woman making a private assessment and arriving at a conclusion. She didn't say what the conclusion was. She didn't need to. "Emma inside?" she said instead. "Probably in her room," Clara said. "She reads in the mornings. Can I say hello?" "Go ahead." Mrs. Teague came through the gate and went inside, and 1 or 2 of the others came after, and Ruth Yancey came last, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the reorganized pots and the mended things and the ordinary signs of a house that was being lived in rather than merely occupied. And then she looked at Clara and said, "It does look different in here." "It works better," Clara said. Ruth Yancey nodded, a slow nod that was doing extra work. "I imagine it does," she said. Later that afternoon, when the visitors had gone and Emma had submitted to being exclaimed over by Mrs. Teague with the composure of a child who had been prepared for adulthood by an unusually thorough education in managing adult emotion, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her coat on and a cup of tea that had gone cool, and she tried to organize her thoughts into something that resembled a decision. Wade came in and sat across from her. He looked at the tea. "It's cold," she said. "I can see that." He didn't get up to warm it. He looked at her. "Clara." She looked back at him. "I have something to ask you," he said, "and I'd like to ask it properly, which means I need you to let me get through it without looking at me like you're already calculating the exit." She put her hands around the cold cup. "All right." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him doing the thing he did, choosing words with unusual care, measuring them before they came out, making sure they were accurate. "I know you had a plan," he said. "Dalton Creek, the Fowler family, $12 a month. A life that was yours and built on your own terms. I'm not going to pretend that isn't worth something, because it's worth a great deal. You put that together out of nothing, the same way you put everything else together." He paused. "I also know that plans sometimes stop fitting what you actually want. And when that happens, you can keep executing the plan anyway, out of stubbornness or principle. Or you can look at what you actually want and see if there's something better." She looked at him. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you want to stay," he said. "Not as a guest, not as a housekeeper, as—" He stopped. "I'm not good at this," he said. "You know that about me." "You're doing all right," she said. "I'm asking if you'd consider making something here," he said. "With me, with Emma." He looked at the table briefly and then back at her with the directness she'd always found striking because it was so without performance. "I know it's not what you came for. I know this is a harder life than a housekeeping position, and I know the town has treated you badly, and you have every reason to decide it's not worth it. But Emma is talking, and the kitchen is organized, and you know where everything is and why, and I—" He stopped again. "I'd like you to stay. That's the whole of it." Clara looked at her cold tea. She thought about Mrs. Fowler's letter, which was warm and kind and waiting. She thought about $12 a month in a room of her own and the plan she'd built out of a classified advertisement. She thought about the plan, and she thought about sitting on steps in a blizzard and a wagon stopping and a voice saying nobody should be out there alone. She thought about all the things a person could do for practical reasons, and all the things that happened anyway, underneath the practical reasons. That turned out to be the real story. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "Neither am I," Wade said. "I'll argue with you about how things should be done." "You'll usually be right," he said. "I've noticed that." She almost smiled. "Emma's going to need patience, real patience, not just for the voice, for all of it. Growing up is hard." "I know," he said. "I can't do it alone." "You were doing it alone," she said. "I was doing something alone," he said. "I'm not sure it counted as doing it." Clara looked at the window, at the winter afternoon outside, the light going orange already over the fields of snow. She thought about what Mrs. Teague had said, like someone standing at a door they've already decided to walk through. She thought that Mrs. Teague was a perceptive woman, and that the observation had been accurate on the platform and had only gotten more accurate since. She thought, finally, that she had spent 23 years building walls out of practicality and calling it wisdom, and that there was a difference between protecting yourself and starving yourself, and she had been working hard enough at the protecting to confuse it with the other thing. "The kitchen is already organized," she said. "Yes," he said, "and the mending's caught up. For now," he said. "Emma's hard on her clothes." "I know that," Clara said. "I've mended 3 of her dresses in the last 2 weeks." "I know," he said. "I noticed." She put the cold cup down. She looked at him across the table, the weathered face, the careful eyes, the man who'd stopped a wagon in a blizzard because nobody should be out there alone, and had never once made that act into more than what it was, had just let it be what it was, and waited. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "I'll stay." He nodded, once, with a slowness that meant something. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't make a speech. He just sat there with his hands around his coffee cup and looked at her with the same care he looked at everything. and she thought that this was what it looked like when a man who'd forgotten how to want something remembered, and was taking it slowly so as not to break it. "I'll write to Mrs. Fowler," Clara said. "All right." "She'll understand." Her letter was kind. "All right," he said again. "And I want to talk to Emma," Clara said. "Properly, so she understands what's happening." "She already knows," Wade said. "She's been listening from the hallway for the last 5 minutes." Clara turned. The hallway was empty, but there was, just at the edge of the doorframe, the heel of a small boot, motionless in the way of someone who had stopped moving precisely because someone had mentioned that they'd been heard. "Emma," Clara said. A pause. "You can come in," Clara said. The boot moved, and Emma appeared in the doorway, pepper in hand, her expression arranged in the studied neutrality of a child who had been caught eavesdropping and was attempting to suggest she'd simply been passing by. She looked at Clara, then at her father, then back at Clara. "Well," Clara said. "Come here." Emma crossed the kitchen and stopped beside Clara's chair, and Clara turned in the chair to face her. They looked at each other at the same level for a moment. The woman who'd come in on the wrong train, and the child who'd knocked on the wrong door, and the life that had happened in the space between those two wrong things. "I'm staying," Clara said. Emma looked at her. Her expression did its usual complicated work of not showing too much, and then showed it anyway. The corners of her mouth, the brightness in her eyes, the small release of breath that was the 8-year-old version of relief. She held out Pepper. Clara took the horse and looked at her, the mismatched button eyes, the lopsided stuffing, the evidence of years of being carried and held and loved hard by a child who didn't have an easy way to say love hard. "I'll put her back on the windowsill," Clara said. "She likes the view." Emma took Pepper back. Then, without drama, she climbed into the empty chair at the table and picked up her paper and pencil and wrote something and pushed it to the center of the table where both Clara and Wade could see it. "Can we have cornbread tonight?" "Yes," Clara said. Emma nodded with satisfaction and began measuring in her head. Wade looked at his daughter and looked at Clara and looked at the table, and the look on his face was not happiness exactly. Happiness was too clean a word for it, too finished. It was something that had been very cold for a long time beginning to warm, which was slower and more complicated and more real. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was going its slow way toward evening, the sky turning colors over the mountains that the mountains didn't ask for and didn't need, but got anyway, because that was what the sky did at the end of a winter day. The snow in the fields had gone blue in the shadow of the peaks. The smoke from the chimney went up straight, which meant the wind had finally decided to leave the Mercer Ranch alone for a while. Clara got up to start the cornbread. She knew where everything was. This was a small thing, and also, in all the ways that mattered, the largest thing. That you could arrive somewhere by accident, through a wrong stop in a storm, and the particular mercy of a man who stopped a wagon, and find that the wrongness of the arrival didn't determine the rightness of the staying. That home was not something you went back to so much as something that got made. In kitchens and fever nights and paper notes pushed across tables, by people who were none of them perfect and all of them trying. You didn't plan for it. You couldn't have. You just got on a train and fell asleep, and when you woke up, if you were very lucky and the right kind of stubborn, you were exactly where you needed to be. She measured the cornmeal. Emma leaned over to watch, tongue just visible at the corner of her mouth, concentrating. Behind them, Wade put another log on the fire. The house, for the first time in a long time, felt like someone was actually living in it.